Chapter 169. Phew. Meng Qi exhaled softly and looked down at her palm. The jade slip was lying on it obediently, and it looked the same as before. Only the bright red bloodline in the center of the yellow jade slip had become a lot lighter. Meng Qi's mind moved, and her spiritual consciousness entered her spiritual sea. There, a jade slip that was almost exactly the same as the one in her palm was completely wrapped in spiritual energy, slowly floating up and down. In the center of the jade slip, there was still a bright red bloodline. When she held the jade slip just now, she could hear the distant sound coming from the jade slip. At this time, she was relying on her spiritual consciousness to sense it, and she felt that she could hear it more clearly. The bloodline in the jade slip seemed to have become alive. The bloodline was like a blood vessel, and Meng Qi could even feel the blood in the bloodline begin to flow again. Meng Qi carefully separated a strand of her spiritual consciousness and slowly touched the jade slip. As soon as her spiritual consciousness touched the jade slip, it retracted as if it was scalded. The jade slip rolled in the air above her spiritual sea. It was obviously a dead object, but Meng Qi felt that the other party seemed to be looking at it proudly. Meng Qi snorted softly, and her spiritual consciousness divided into 8 strands, wrapping around the jade slip from all directions. This time, under her control, the strands of spiritual consciousness wrapped around the jade slip almost rudely. As soon as her spiritual consciousness touched the jade slip, she heard a dong sound in her ears. The sound was not loud, and it was a little far away, as if someone was standing in the vast world, holding a drumstick and hitting a big leather drum heavily. The jade slip wriggled and rolled again, as if it was trying to escape from Meng Qi's divine sense. Meng Qi simply sent out a strand of spiritual consciousness, which again divided into 8 strands, wrapping around the jade slip.
Dong.
Dong, dong, dong. This time, she heard it more clearly. It was not the beating of a drum, but the beating of something's heart. Beat after beat, slow, lively, and powerful. Accompanied by the sound of this heartbeat, Meng Qi felt as if a scroll of painting had unfolded in front of her eyes. There were only a few strokes in the painting, but the landscape was vivid on the paper. Surrounded by towering mountains, a huge lake reflected the stars. Stars twinkled, and there seemed to be clouds lingering above the mountains. In the sky, there were 7 stars that were obviously much brighter. They were arranged in the shape of the Big Dipper, corresponding to the 7 towering mountains. After staring at the painting for a long time, Meng Qi felt that everything in front of him gradually came to life. The stars were shining brightly, the mountains were like sharp swords pointing to the sky, and the clouds on top of the mountains seemed to merge with the night sky, making her unable to distinguish between the mountains and the night sky. There seemed to be a cool breeze blowing over the lake between the mountains, causing ripples to appear on the surface of the lake. The ripples spread out in circles, shattering the starlight in the lake. At the very end, only the 7 stars that were as bright as the Big Dipper were still shining brightly. They were like the kings of the world, overlooking their own territory. The mountain, the lake, the stars and the night sky. Meng Qi looked at it in a daze. She only felt that her spiritual sense was being separated and slowly immersed in the lake. As she got closer, she could see the sparkling starlight in the clear lake. She could even feel that the cold lake water did not affect her spiritual sense at all. A strange feeling completely enveloped Meng Qi. Around her spiritual sense, tiny starlight twinkled. The water in the lake did not feel like water, but more like something soft, which made her feel very comfortable, right? Meng Qi suddenly trembled, and then she felt that someone was holding her hand. A voice that seemed to come from a very, very far place finally broke through the heavy obstacles and reached her ears. Meng Qi? Meng Qi? Meng Qi? Chi-Chi, wake up. Meng Qi suddenly opened her eyes. Phew! Someone in front of her breathed a sigh of relief, and Xigong Xing's voice sounded. Meng Qi, you're finally awake. As she spoke, she reached out and pinched her face. You didn't respond no matter how we called you just now. You scared us to death. Only then did Meng Qi realize that she was actually lying on the ground. The grass on the ground was soft. Beside her, Si Kongxing and the others surrounded her. Everyone looked at her worriedly. Meng Qi opened her mouth, and her voice was hoarse, as if it had been tempered in sand. Drink some water. Si Kongxing helped her up, let her lean on her shoulder, and handed her a small water bottle. The cold water with the fragrance of nectar moistened Meng Qi's cracked lips. What happened to me? Meng Qi also breathed a sigh of relief. She knew that something must have happened when she was checking the jade slip. You suddenly fainted. Si Kongxing put away the water bottle and said, Li Che can't tell what happened to you. Fainted? Meng Qi was startled. Her consciousness had always been clear, so how could she have fainted? It should be known that it was not easy for Xiozha to faint. Once they were injured or consumed too much of their spiritual energy and fainted, logically speaking, their entire consciousness would be lost, and they would not be able to control their consciousness. How long have I been unconscious? Meng Qi asked again in a hoarse voice. 2 hours. Si Kongxing quickly said. Meng Qi. Li Che was right beside her and asked, What happened? I want to check your situation, but I can't send my spiritual energy into your body. There's a very powerful force blocking my spiritual energy. Meng Qi spread out her hands and looked down at the jade slip in her palm. She felt that she had only stared at the painting for a moment, but 2 hours had already passed. This jade slip. Li Che followed Meng Qi's gaze and looked over. He was a little worried. Is there something strange? Meng Qi closed her eyes and then took out a blank bamboo slip from her storage brocade pouch. She held the bamboo slip and wanted to draw the mountains, rivers, and stars that she had seen. Once a Xiozha had the outline of a picture in their mind, they only needed to send in a little spiritual energy to draw the entire picture. But this time, she had just sketched a corner of a mountain in the bamboo slip, where her spiritual energy instantly became empty. All the spiritual energy was completely sucked out, and she could not draw another stroke. Meng Qi. What's wrong? Li Che looked at Meng Qi without blinking and asked worriedly. I saw a picture in that jade slip. Meng Qi could only say, I suspect that it's the fallen star C in the demon realm, FQXSW. Orgshi paused and continued, I wanted to draw it for you to see, but after just one stroke, my spiritual energy has been used up. Li Che, Si Kongxing, and the others gasped, 1 stroke. Yes. Meng Qi said as she took out a Biming pill and ate it. She opened her mouth and continued, the mountains, rivers, and stars in the sky all look like the Big Dipper. That's it. Si Kongxing clapped his hands and said excitedly, although I haven't seen it with my own eyes, I heard from my father that around the fallen star sea in the demon realm, 7 mountains are indeed arranged like the Big Dipper. Yes. Meng Qi nodded. Then, how did you fall unconscious? Li Che was puzzled. He held Meng Qi's wrist again and sent a wisp of spiritual energy into her body through her meridians. This time, there was no longer that strange force blocking his way, and Li Che was able to smoothly send in his own spiritual energy. Strange, he murmured, now it's possible again. I looked at that painting and seemed to have entered the lake. Meng Qi recalled, then I heard the stars calling me. I didn't see anything else in the jade slip except this painting. Meng Qi said, I didn't see the words 7 kills or 7 emotions. She turned to look at Pei Mufeng and returned the jade slip to him. Pei Mufeng said, several elders of the Fallen Star Pavilion worked together, but they could only barely see the words 7 kills. You don't have to force yourself too much. Yes. Meng Qi nodded. She stood up with the help of Si Kongxing. Her spiritual energy was gradually restored, and so was her force. Let's enter the array, Meng Qi said. She had always been decisive. Since they couldn't use the jade slip, there was no need to delay any longer. Okay. Si Kongxing and the others nodded. Only Li Che was still thinking with his head lowered. He murmured, what was the force in Meng Qi's body just now? Si Kongxing patted him on the shoulder. Don't think about it. Let's enter the array first. Huh. Oh. Li Che came back to his senses and nodded. Let's enter the array first. As he spoke, He couldn't help but look at Meng Qi again. He was still thinking about how she stopped his spiritual energy from entering Meng Qi's body to investigate. The spiritual energy of medical cultivators was mostly gentle and mild. It was rarely blocked by other people's spiritual energy. Moreover, he felt that the scene in front of him was somewhat familiar, but he couldn't remember when he had encountered it. Or Li Che was deep in thought. Had he seen it in that book? The 7 of them stood on the hillside and looked around. They didn't know when, but 7 different colored light gates lit up on the hillside. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and purple. At this moment, the closest one to them was a red light gate. The light gate was almost transparent. Through the light gate, they could even see the hillside behind it. It was like a transparent flame silently burning fiercely. Let's go. Pei Mufeng was also decisive. He led the way and walked towards the red light gate. He hadn't put away his natal sword. At this moment, it was floating beside him, with the tip of the sword pointing forward. At this moment, among the 7 of them, Pei Mufeng's cultivation was the highest. His combat power was also the strongest. Originally, Yan Xian was neck and neck with him. However, after he was injured and his inner core was damaged, even if he wasn't affected by the damage of his inner core in Shijue Mountain, he was still slightly weaker than Pei Mufeng. Then, there was Qin Xiuma, Chu Tianfeng, and Xikong Xing. These 3 people's cultivation was about the same. Li Che's cultivation was about the same as them. However, as a medical practitioner, his combat power was slightly weaker. Meng Qi's cultivation was the lowest among the 7 of them. However, not only was she a medical practitioner, she also had the help of formations. In terms of combat power, she was probably above Li Che. When Pei Mufeng was in front, Yan Xian walked to the back. Qin Xiuma walked side by side with him. In front of them were Meng Qi and Xikong Xing. In front of them, Chu Tianfeng and Li Che were side by side. The red light gate was right in front of them. Pei Mufeng raised his hand. His natal sword rushed towards the light gate. He followed behind and stepped into the gate. Chu Tianfeng looked back at Meng Qi and nodded at her. He opened his right hand, and a red lotus bloomed in his palm. Li Che's natal cauldron also floated beside him. He held a medicine knife in his right hand. The 2 of them didn't hesitate. They followed behind Pei Mufeng and stepped into the light gate. Xikong Xing waved her hand. A fluffy red little fox immediately lay on her shoulder. The little fox opened its big eyes. Its fluffy head rubbed against Xikong Xing's cheek. Then it looked at the red light gate. Its little ears twitched, and its little body trembled. Meng Qi raised her hand, and the 5-spirit cauldron flew out. She held the medicine knife in her left hand, and a protective magic treasure appeared in her right hand. Let's go in. Xikong Xing nodded at Meng Qi and stepped into the light gate. Meng Qi then went through the red light gate. She only felt a blur in front of her, and she was already standing in the light gate. Before Meng Qi could see the surrounding scenery clearly, a crisp sound of birds chirping entered her ears. His nose also smelled a sweet and pleasant floral fragrance. The fragrance of the flowers wasn't strong, but it was refreshing. Meng Qi couldn't help but take a deep breath. Her limbs and bones seemed to have been cleansed by the fragrance of the flowers. She became exceptionally relaxed. At this moment, a pleasant voice sounded in her ears. The voice sounded very young. There was a slight rise at the end of the voice. It sounded like a delicate young girl. Under the afternoon sun, she was smiling and chatting with her best friend. But what she said was not interesting at all. This is the first test of the 7 emotions array. 2 people need to pass the first test together before they can enter the next test. The female voice paused and then continued. If you successfully pass the first test, you can enter the second test. If you fail, the 7 of you who entered the 7 emotions array will be trapped in the array forever. Hee, you have to work hard. Then Meng Qi heard Li Che's cheers. My old master Li Tian. Mahayana medical cultivators above. This is 100 spirit grass. No waterflower. Starcliff grass. This. Star dust stone. Meng Qi. Li Che turned his head and waved desperately at Meng Qi. Meng Qi, come and see if this is a stardust stone. There was a stream in front of Li Che. The stream was so clear that the bottom could be seen. It made a splashing sound. The spirit grass and spirit flowers that made Li Che shout were growing beside the stream. 100 spirit grass, no water flower, star cliff grass. These were all rare flowers and herbs that were rarely seen in the world of medicine. For medical cultivators, they were treasures of heaven and earth. In addition to the spirit grass that Li Che named, there were also countless rare flowers and herbs on both sides of the stream. Meng Qi looked around and could hardly see the end of it. She couldn't even name some of these rare flowers and herbs. No wonder there was such a refreshing fragrance here. With so many rare spirit grass and spirit flowers gathered together, just the aura they emitted could make sick ordinary people recover without medicine. The sun shone from the sky and shone on the stream. The clear stream was not deep. Meng Qi and Li Che could clearly see the stones at the bottom of the stream. Those stones were of different shapes and looked like ordinary pebbles. After being washed by the stream for many years, they had become smooth and lovely. But if one looked carefully, they would find that under the sun, those stones were shining. The light was not bright. It was as fine as gold fragments sprinkled on the water. It looked like small stars. Meng Qi. Li Che's tone was very excited. He pulled Meng Qi's sleeve and urged her to squat down with him. This. His attention had completely moved away from the stones at the bottom of the stream. Instead, he pointed to several inconspicuous spirit grass beside the stream. Each of those spirit grass had 2 leaves on it. The leaves were green, as if they had been washed. The leaves were very small, about the size of a human fingernail. They looked very ordinary. However, on every green blade of grass, there were dark red threads that traced the edges of the blades of grass. The dark red filaments were very thin. If one didn't get close and observe carefully, it would be difficult to see the pattern. Li Che's expression became very serious. He slowly stretched out his hand. When he was about to touch the leaf, he hesitated and stopped. Meng Qi. Li Che rubbed his hand on his own robe and turned to Meng Qi. Why don't you do it? He smiled a little embarrassedly. I'm afraid that my hands and feet will accidentally break it. Li Che looked into Meng Qi's eyes as he spoke. He asked in a low voice, Meng Qi, is this the netherworld thorn? He didn't wait for Meng Qi to answer. He quickly said, right? It's the netherworld thorn, right? Li Che seemed to be convincing himself, but also seemed to be recalling something. He slowly read, the netherworld thorn grows by the water. It grows a leaf every 300 years. Another 300 years, 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 the leaf falls and decays, losing its medicinal properties. There are dark red lines on the edge of the leaf. On the back of the leaf, there are small dark red thorns as thin as cow hair. It can be used as medicine to cure all injuries and reconstruct the inner core. After Li Che finished reading this paragraph, he stared blankly at the tiny leaf. Then he muttered the last few words of his own. Cure all injuries, reconstruct the inner core, reconstruct the inner core. He still turned to look at Meng Qi blankly. He didn't even blink. The netherworld thorn. Meng Qi, do you think this is the netherworld thorn? Li Che quickly said, I only saw it in the sect's ancient records. Master said that the netherworld thorn had already gone extinct 10,000 years ago. The netherworld river dried up, and the netherworld thorn disappeared from the world. Only the ancient medical practitioners have seen it. But, his gaze turned to the small stream that flowed endlessly. He asked blankly, is this the netherworld river? The netherworld river was also recorded in the ancient records. Why do I feel like something's wrong? Li Che scratched his head blankly. I've only seen records of the netherworld river in books. It said that at that time, the Three Mountains world wasn't the Three Mountains world. It was just a very, very big world. Humans, demons, and devils all lived in it. The netherworld river was underground in the extreme north. The ground was frozen all year round. The ground was extremely hard, and almost no grass grew there. Only the netherworld thorn grew on the banks of the netherworld river. It was very difficult to pick it up. Whether it was the netherworld river or the netherworld thorn, they were almost like legends to medical practitioners. Otherwise, as the only son of the Mirror Moon Sky Sect Master and such a genius, Yan Xian's inner core wouldn't have been damaged. He wouldn't have been unable to recover from the setback.
Yes.
Meng Qi responded softly. Could it be that the netherworld river and the netherworld thorn really exist? Li Che muttered. Then does that mean Yan Xian can be saved? He turned to look at Meng Qi. Meng Qi's gaze fell on the few small, inconspicuous blades of grass. The dark red patterns outlined the leaves of the grass. Even under the sunlight, it looked a bit strange. But this is the netherworld river? Li Che looked at the cheerful stream in disbelief. No matter how he looked at it, he felt that it was too different from the legendary river Styx. Meng Qi had already taken out a glove from her storage bag. The silver-white glove was very tough. It was also resistant to all kinds of poisons and water and fire. She carefully reached out to the netherworld thorn. Be careful. Li Che reached out and grabbed Meng Qi's wrist. He also had a similar glove. Medical practitioners often had to pick herbs for themselves, so they would have a similar glove. Li Che took out his glove and put it on. Let me do it. The netherworld thorn looks like an ordinary blade of grass, but it's called a thorn. Li Che explained, because the thorn on the back of the blade of grass is very powerful. He adjusted his posture, took out a detoxification pill, and stuffed it into his mouth. Then he continued, it's said that although it's as thin as a cow's hair, once it touches a person's skin, it will silently drill into the body and enter the spiritual sea and internal organs along the meridians. It only takes 10 breaths to kill a insightful truth cultivator. A insightful truth cultivator. Li Che continued, that's a top master who's only one step away from the Mahayana realm. He adjusted his posture again and carefully reached out his hand to the netherworld thorn. It's said that only the moment the thorn touches a person's hand, he or she can barely survive. But, Li Che said, it's said that when the thorn touches a person's skin, he or she can't feel it at all. By the time he or she can react, it has already invaded his or her spiritual sea and internal organs.
Sigh.
He sighed and tried to reach out his hand to the netherworld thorn again. He hesitated, but in the end, he still didn't touch the blade of grass.
He's so talkative.
On the cliff in the distance, the black-card sword cultivator sat on the cliff with his arms lazily crossed in front of his chest. He looked at the scene in front of him and curled his lips. Then he excitedly turned his head to look at the red-clothed woman and the white-haired man. Why don't we make a bet and see if he dares to touch the netherworld thorn? The white-haired man snorted and turned his head away in disdain. The red-clothed woman glared at him. I bet he'll pluck it. Then I bet he won't. The sword cultivator said with a smile, look at how scared he is. I bet he won't pass this test. If he can't pass the first test, the remaining 6 tests will be harder and harder. The little girl will also be unlucky with him. I don't know what he was thinking at the beginning. He must send 2 people to each test. As long as one of them can't pass, he will fail. TSK, TSK, TS. The sword cultivator shook his head and sighed.
Hey.
You're not gloating, are you? The red-clothed woman glared at him again. We don't have much time left. If they also fail, we might not be able to last for another 100 years. I've said it before. It doesn't matter even if the Sanfu world is destroyed. If we die, we die. Who cares if the Sanfu world behind us is flooded and turned into a purgatory? The black-clothed man curled his lips and revealed a mocking and wanton smile. Hearing this, the red-clothed woman and the white-haired man looked at each other worriedly. The 2 of them didn't say anything and just stood quietly behind the sword cultivator. The mountain wind blew their hair. The red-clothed woman waited for a moment and finally couldn't help but ask the white-haired man, do you think they'll pluck it? Maybe they will, maybe they won't. The white-haired man shook his head. Although I'm also a medical cultivator, I can't guess what every medical cultivator is thinking. He paused and said, or maybe they can think of a better way. Beside the stream, Li Che's hand was still hovering over the netherworld spike. He didn't move for a long time. He closed his eyes, as if he was talking to Meng Qi, but also as if he was talking to himself. What if this isn't the netherworld spike?
Yes.
Meng Qi responded. Let me do it. Her expression was rather calm as she extended her hand towards the nether thorn.
Wait.
Li Che grabbed Meng Qi's wrist and stopped her again. Let's look around first and see if there's anything else. He thought for a moment and said, what if this is really the netherworld spike? What if it's really the same as the legends? What if something happens to us and the 7 emotions formation can't be broken? All right. Meng Qi nodded. Medical cultivators aren't reckless and fearless. If they can't even protect themselves, they can't help more people. She withdrew her hand and stood up with Li Che. In the stream, Meng Qi's gaze fell on the stream. Those stones were still lying quietly at the bottom of the water, shining with fine light. She walked a few steps towards the stream, squatted down, and carefully looked at the stones at the bottom of the water. It's a Stardust stone. It's really... Li Che stared blankly. There should still be Stardust stones in the Demon Realm and the Demon Realm, but they were rare in the 3 Millennia world. But the Styx River... He glanced warily at the flowing stream before focusing his gaze into the distance. As far as the eye could see, they were in a large field. There were no mountains around, and the edge of the field seemed to be connected with the sky. The stream crossed the entire field, and they couldn't see the end of it.
Huh?
Li Che seemed to have finally reacted. Where are they? He was dazzled by the spirit herbs and spirit flowers just now, and only now did he realize that there were only 2 people, Meng Qi and himself. Xigong Xing, and the others were nowhere to be seen. Meng Qi. Li Che almost jumped up. Where are they? He and Meng Qi were both medical cultivators, and their combat power ranked last among the 7 people. If something really happened, they couldn't fight back. Didn't you hear someone talking just now? Meng Qi asked. Huh? Li Che looked at her blankly. Meng Qi explained calmly, this is the first level. She looked around and said, this level is for the 2 of us. After passing the first level, we will go to the next level. So there are only 2 of us here? Li Che was stunned.
Yes.
Meng Qi nodded. It should be so. Where are they? Li Che asked blankly. I don't know. Meng Qi shook her head. How do we pass this level? Li Che asked again. I don't know. Meng Qi still shook her head. Li Che. He stared blankly at the calm Meng Qi. Then what should we do? Let's see what's around us first. Meng Qi smiled at him and repeated what Li Che said just now. But Li Che wanted to say something, but he closed his mouth in the end. Let's go. Meng Qi squatted down again and made a simple mark on the ground where the netherworld spikes were, in case they couldn't find this place later. She stood up and patted Li Che, who was standing beside her in a daze. Since we're here, we can only take 1 step at a time.
Oh.
Li Che nodded. His body suddenly stiffened. After a while, he turned his head stiffly and stared at Meng Qi. Meng Qi. Li Che swallowed his saliva. I heard that person speak. Huh? Meng Qi looked at him. A girl with a very pleasant voice just spoke to me. She said that this is the first level and that you and I are going to pass it. If we pass, we'll go to the next level. If we don't... Li Che's Adam's apple bobbed up and down. His body stiffened. If we don't pass, the 7 of us will be trapped here forever. He looked at Meng Qi. Is that so? Meng Qi frowned. She didn't tell him this just now because she didn't want to make Li Che nervous. So, Li Che didn't need Meng Qi to answer. From her expression, he guessed that Meng Qi also heard these words. And she also told me that if one of us doesn't pass, we won't pass the first level. Meng Qi. He suddenly became very nervous. This is the first level. What exactly do we have to do? How can we pass the first level? If Li Che was the one who treated the patient, he wouldn't be nervous even if the patient was seriously injured or terminally ill. but passing the level and passing the test. This has never been his strength. Especially if they had to fight, he would definitely become a burden to Meng Qi. Meng Qi. Li Chei's face was pale. The joy of seeing so many spirit herbs and spirit flowers just now completely disappeared. Li Chei's heart was full of worry and fear. If he was alone, he might not be so afraid. But as soon as he thought about the other 6 people who would be trapped here forever because of him, he couldn't control his nervousness and worry. Don't think about this first, Meng Qi said softly. Maybe that person is just scaring us. But they really aren't here, Li Chei murmured. It's just the 2 of us. His lips trembled slightly, as pale as his face. If we have to fight, what do we do? They were 2 medical cultivators. Even if the other party's cultivation was lower than theirs, they probably wouldn't be a match for them. Stardust Stone, Netherworld Thorn, 100 Spirit Grass, all of these were suddenly thrown to the back of Li Chei's mind. Not only was his face pale, but his body also seemed to become incomparably heavy. Li Chei opened his mouth again, but found that he didn't know what else to say. He could only stare at Meng Qi in a daze. So, we must pass the first test. Meng Qi's voice was still calm and gentle. But Li Chei still wanted to say something, but Meng Qi shook his hand at him and said firmly, "Let's go check out the surroundings first and figure out what's going on here." Okay. Li Chei nodded. Let's go. Meng Qi's tone was very firm, and he walked forward along the stream. Li Chei followed behind him with heavy footsteps. He was too excited just now, and didn't even notice that the others weren't here. There was only him and Meng Qi, only the 2 of them. If they couldn't pass the first test, then the other people would stay here because of him, and he didn't even know if they were alive or dead. Well, what should he do? He. At this moment, Li Chei heard the pleasant female voice again. The first test is already the easiest of the 7 tests. Her voice was crisp and even a little proud, but it's not that easy to pass the easiest test. If it's one of you, that powerful and handsome swordsman, he should be able to pass. Pei Mufeng? Li Chei thought silently in his heart. Yes. The other party seemed to be able to hear the voice in his heart, and said cheerfully, it's that Pei Mufeng. If it's him and Meng Qi, one is a swordsman and the other is a medical practitioner, they should be able to pass this test. She said with a smile. Then what about me? Li Chei couldn't help but ask in his heart. But if it's you, the woman dragged her voice, as if she was deep in thought. Li Chei suddenly became nervous. What if it's me? Won't it be impossible? If it's you, you 2 medical practitioners won't be able to defeat him, the woman said in a relaxed tone, as if it was a matter of fact. Her words poked at the thing Li Chei was most worried about. That's right. He and Meng Qi were 2 medical practitioners, but he was far inferior to Xue Qingxian. Xue Qingxian was the eldest son of the Xue family of the Wind Alliance and the future sect master of the #1 medical practitioner sect in the world. Even if he wasn't as strong as Pei Mufeng, who was a top swordsman, he still had the power to fight. He was much stronger than Li Chei. If it's that kid from the Xue family, the woman said again, there's still hope. Li Chei's expression became even more unsightly. Sigh. The woman seemed to be sighing for him. Fortunately, you and that little girl didn't touch the netherworld spike. If you did, no matter which one of you touched the netherworld spike, one of you would die, and you would have failed the first test. But then again, the woman continued, with your cultivation and combat strength, it doesn't make a difference whether you touch the netherworld spike or not. In any case, you won't be able to pass. Li Chei tightly closed his mouth. This 7 emotions formation has been open for tens of thousands of years. It's not like there haven't been any cultivators who have passed the 7 tests. But in the few times that they passed, there was only 1 medical practitioner among the 7 people who came in. The woman seemed to have not spoken to anyone for a long time. She continued to talk nonstop. 2 medical cultivators like you will encounter such a situation. There's nothing we can do about it, she said with a grin. Actually, your luck is pretty good. It's the first test. If it's the later tests, you might have already failed the moment you opened your eyes. Li Che. Cold sweat poured down from his body. At this moment, Meng Qi, who was walking in front of him, suddenly stopped and turned to look at Li Che.
Li Che.
Li Che responded instinctively. Don't listen to that person, Meng Qi said. Huh? Is there someone beside your ear who keeps saying that us two medical cultivators won't be able to pass the first test? Meng Qi asked. Li Che. Don't pay attention to her, Meng Qi repeated. Don't pay attention to what she says and don't believe it. But, wasn't what that person said the truth? This is the 7 emotions formation. Meng Qi reminded Li Che. Although I don't know what this formation is like, think about the 7 emotions flower. 7 emotions flower? Li Che was slightly startled. Yes. Meng Qi nodded. 7 emotions flower. Li Che looked at Meng Qi blankly. He didn't quite understand what she meant. Magic formation. Meng Qi simply took a few steps back and stood side by side with Li Che. Let's talk as we walk. The two of them continued to walk along the stream. Meng Qi said, some magic formations can amplify the effect of the medicine. She said, therefore, although I don't know what this 7 emotions formation is, I think it's very likely that it's using the magic formation to amplify the effect of the 7 emotions flower. Li Che nodded. He didn't quite understand. However, he was focused on listening to Meng Qi. The girl's voice in his mind didn't affect him as much. Meng Qi continued, the 7 emotions flower and the falling heartwood can make people fall into the 7 emotions illusion and magnify the 7 emotions and 6 desires. The test of this 7 emotions formation is very likely to use our 7 emotions inner demons. Her tone was still calm, so calm that it was even a little cold. Therefore, don't pay attention to that person's words. She's making you fall into fear and worry.
Ha ha ha.
Before Li Che could speak, he heard a clear laughter in his mind. Your little friend is really interesting. The woman laughed happily. 2 little cultivators. One of them is a Yuaniing cultivator, and the other just separated his spirit. I don't need to go through so much trouble to plot against you. She smiled. I'm just reminding you out of kindness. It's up to you to believe it or not. Li Che. Li Che felt a weight on his arm. Meng Qi held his elbow. Don't listen to her. But... He opened his mouth with difficulty. He wanted to say that what that person said made sense. Don't listen. Meng Qi's eyes were clear and firm. She looked into Li Che's eyes and reminded him, don't be fooled. Li Che. We can definitely do it. Meng Qi said, think about it. It was the 2 of us who cured so many people and found the entrance to the 7 emotions formation. Xiao Ran helped us when we were in the formation. Li Che murmured. When Xiao Ran and I didn't find you, you were already saving people. Meng Qi's tone was firm. You can do it. Meng Qi, Li Che still wanted to say something, but the voice in his mind laughed again. This little girl is really cute. I've decided. After you fail, let the little girl accompany me. With such an interesting little girl by my side to talk to, my life won't be so boring.
Li Che.
Meng Qi held Li Che's arm tightly. A wisp of spiritual energy was sent out from her fingertips. Don't listen to her. Empty spirit technique? The woman giggled again.
Little cutie is really interesting.
If the empty spirit technique is useful, how can so many cultivators die? Sometimes. The woman dragged her voice. Cultivators have lived for tens of thousands of years. How many people can reach the Mahayana stage? Not to mention the Mahayana stage, even the Avatar stage is a step away from heaven and earth. Sometimes, even if you think you can do it, you can definitely do it. Li Che frowned slightly. Human power is sometimes limited. The woman smiled playfully. So many cultivators who failed to pass the Jindan stage tribulation and died. Before they died, they also believed that they could pass the tribulation and succeed. With your talent, if you go further up the Avatar stage, well, you'll probably reach the end of the Dongshu stage. Medical talent is also limited. Now, you'll reach the peak of the 3rd grade. If you go further up the 4th grade, you still have some hope of reaching the 5th grade. After that, you won't be able to do it. The woman smiled and said, Little boy, remember my words. Even if you're at the peak of the Dongxi stage, don't force yourself to pass the tribulation. At that time, your soul will scatter and you'll die. Li Che felt as if he was struck by lightning. Meng Qi's words gradually couldn't enter his ears. His Shizhuan once said that although he was a talented disciple of his sect, the Songhai Academy. However, in the southern land where the Songhai Academy was located, medical cultivation was already declining. The Songhai Academy was able to become one of the 10 great sects of the southern land. First, there was a rule in the southern land. The 10 great sects of the 4 realms must have a medical cultivation sect. Therefore, the Songhai Academy was able to become one of the 10 great sects of the southern land. If the Songhai Academy was in the eastern land or the western land, or even the northern land where the overall strength of the sects was relatively weak, they probably wouldn't have a place in the 10 great sects. Li Che Shizhuan was only at the Dongxi stage and had 5th grade medical skills. His Shizhuan once said that it would be very difficult for Li Che to surpass him. He would probably stop at 5th grade medical skills and Dongxi stage cultivation. Didi Pavilion. If he could enter a top medical cultivation sect like the Wind Alliance, there would be a glimmer of hope for him to go further. However, his talent was limited, and his hope wasn't high. He could only rely on various treasures to force himself to improve. At this moment, the woman's words were like iron hammers hammering Li Che's heart. He couldn't. There was a voice in his ear that kept repeating. Even with Meng Qi's comfort, he knew that he couldn't do it. He couldn't compare to Xueqing Xian, Pei Mufeng, Si Gongxing, and the others. Meng Qi, who also came from a small sect, was far more talented than him.
He really couldn't do it.
Li Che thought sadly. He was destined to disappoint Meng Qi. He also didn't know why he and Shizhuan would enter this 7 emotions formation together with Yan Xian and the others. It should have been Qiao Ran who came in. Why did it have to be him? He couldn't do it. Li Che. Li Che. Meng Qi grabbed Li Che's arm, and his voice became louder and louder. Don't listen to that person's words anymore. This little girl is really interesting and kind. She's still trying to comfort you. But even if she comforts you now, what's the use? She's just lying to you and Shizhuan. When we fight later, she'll know how useless Shizhuan's companions are. The woman's every word seemed to poke Li Che's heart. She'll find out that 2 medical cultivators are not enough. This little girl's talent in formations is not bad, and she's been trained and taught by an expert. She still has the strength to fight. But you, Sai, what should we do? The woman sighed heavily again. Her voice was clearly filled with compassion. But every word was like a sharp knife stabbing into Li Che's heart. That sharp blade dug out all the fears that he usually hid very deeply and had never told anyone before, and displayed them in front of him and himself, dripping with blood. Your little friends are all a bunch of kind-hearted children. Usually, they wouldn't despise you, and it's the same this time. Because of you, they can't even pass the first stage and can only be trapped here forever. But don't worry, they won't blame you. The woman giggled again. No one will blame you. Even if they're dragged down by you because you're trapped in this place, they still won't blame you. Isn't this little girl the same? She clearly knows that because of you, they won't be able to pass the stage. But she still keeps comforting you, afraid that you'll be sad.
Sigh.
The woman sighed loudly again. You're all medical cultivators. Sometimes, good medicine tastes bitter, and honest words are unpleasant to the ear. But that's the best. But what's the use of comforting me like this? Li Che obviously couldn't see her, but he felt like there was a pair of beautiful, compassionate eyes looking at him. He opened his eyes and met Meng Qi's worried gaze. Meng Qi. Li Che opened his mouth and called out hoarsely.
Li Che.
Meng Qi looked into his eyes. You, what should I do? He looked at Meng Qi. What should I do? Li Che said with difficulty. I don't want to drag you down.
Li Che.
Meng Qi said, don't listen to that person. She's deliberately disturbing our minds. Since this is the 7 emotions array. But she's right. Li Che murmured, Pei Mufeng is the #1 sword cultivator of the younger generation in the East Land. He's the most outstanding sword cultivator in the 4 realms. Qin Xiuma comes from the top of the clouds. He cultivates both swordsmanship and swordsmanship. He's extremely talented. Chu Tianfeng is still young, but his natal technique, Chu Bao, already has 7 petals. In a few years, his lotus will have 9 petals. Even if Yan Xian isn't injured, he'll still have the power to fight with Yan Xian. If Yan Xian isn't injured, he'll be the #1 sword cultivator in the 4 realms. Although Si Gongxing is a demon cultivator, he's from a famous sect. His defensive technique is extremely strong. Meng Qi. His gaze fell on Meng Qi's face. He said in a hoarse voice, "Your medical talent is outstanding. You were recognized by Senior Lin Yan. Your talent in formations is even more outstanding. The head of the Ji clan also wants to take you as his disciple. Only I." Li Che looked lonely. "I don't know how I got into your group. Now I'm dragging you down."
Li Che.
Meng Qi raised his voice. "It's not like that. Ha ha ha." The woman laughed cheerfully in Li Che's ear. "You're really a kind child. You're still trying to comfort you. Unfortunately, if you were replaced by another little swordsman, Qiao Ran from the Broken Space Sect, they would have a chance to break this 7 emotions array. Unfortunately, it's you who came in."
Ah.
Li Che suddenly shook off Meng Qi's hand. He suddenly jumped up, turned around, and ran behind him. Chapter 170. Li Che. Meng Qi shouted and immediately chased after Li Che. Meng Qi. The blue-robed youth did not even look back as he ran quickly. "Don't come over, let me. I want to be alone for a while." He ran so fast that the wind whistled past his ears and cut his face painfully. Ha 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 ha. He could still hear that woman's voice. It was like gangrene attached to his bones. No matter how fast or far he ran, he could not get rid of it, that's right. But she suddenly changed the topic. "Why didn't you leave them earlier? You are different from them in the first place. You shouldn't be with them in the first place. Admit it, you actually want to be with them. After all, they are all geniuses. You will get more benefits if you follow them. Look, didn't you enter the 7 emotions formation together this time?" "That's not it." Li Che roared in a low voice. "That's not it. If you weren't greedy, you would have left them earlier. Then the one who came in this time should be that little swordsman from the Broken Space Sect. Or 2 medical cultivators came in. That medical cultivator from the Wind Alliance is also stronger than you. If it's him, then the little girl will have a fighting chance if she joins forces with him." "I'm not." Li Che weakly muttered an explanation. Ha ha ha. The woman did not speak anymore and just kept laughing. "I'm not." Li Che's mind was in a mess. He did not know if he was trying to explain to her or to convince himself. "I never thought about it. I just, ha ha ha." The woman laughed arrogantly. "Of course you won't admit it. But if it's just you, why did you go to the Starfall Sea? Why did you walk with the top geniuses of the 3,000 worlds? Why did you enter the 7 emotions formation?" "I'm not." Li Che shook his head. Just like this, he did not need to listen to what the woman said. "I'm not." His face was pale, and his tone was weak. I'm not. Ha ha ha." The woman only laughed, her voice getting louder and louder. Li Che." Behind Li Che, Meng Qi's voice grew louder. "Stop, Meng Qi." Li Che raised his hand and covered his ears. "Let me go. I can't do anything to help. I'll only be a burden to you. Don't worry about me, let me go." Li Che didn't even dare to turn around when he said those words. His eyes were a little hot. "Li Che, be careful." Meng Qi snorted softly. Her right hand clasped onto a Xian spirit stone as she reminded him loudly, "You stepped on the waterless flower."
Ah.
Li Che almost subconsciously jumped up and looked at his feet. With a whoosh, an 8th-grade spirit stone fell beside him. Immediately after, a slender green figure flashed over. Meng Qi held the medicine knife horizontally and drew a magic circle on the ground with a swish. Before Li Che could react, a few more spirit stones fell beside him and embedded themselves into the array. He rushed forward. A blue light flashed in front of him, and a wall of light suddenly rose up. The wall of light was soft and tough. When Li Che crashed into it, it was as if he had crashed into a pile of soft fabric, but it firmly stopped him. "Why are you running?" The green-clothed woman stood in front of him, holding the medicine knife horizontally. Her big black and white eyes were staring at him without blinking. Li Che tilted his head, not daring to look at Meng Qi. His gaze unconsciously fell on the ground beside him, looking at the waterless flower that he had almost stepped on just now. If it was placed in the 3,000 worlds, such a waterless flower would be enough to make all the medical cultivation sects in the 3,000 worlds fight over it. But here, there were many similar flowers growing around the waterless flower. They swayed with the wind, and their soft petals stretched out. Li Che seemed to be in a daze. "If you run away, what should I do?" Meng Qi asked.
Ah.
Li Che was stunned. He subconsciously looked at Meng Qi, a little dazed. "If you run away, what should I do?" Meng Qi repeated her question. "You?" Li Che couldn't help but scratch his head again. He didn't know how to answer Meng Qi's question. Meng Qi pointed at herself. "Nascent soul early stage, right?" Li Che nodded. "Her cultivation is a whole realm lower than yours," Meng Qi said, "and she's also a medical cultivator like you." "But is my cultivation lower than yours?" Meng Qi interrupted him. She rarely had such a domineering attitude and tone. Li Che was completely confused. He could only nod again. Meng Qi's cultivation was indeed lower than his. It was a whole realm lower than his. "Now we can only rely on the two of us," Meng Qi said again. "If you run away, do you want me, a little nascent soul medical cultivator, to pass the first stage of the 7 emotions formation in the 10 extremes mountain by myself?" Li Che. When Meng Qi spoke, her eyes were still staring at him without blinking. Her gaze was clear. Li Che could even see his own small reflection in her eyes. After a long while, he turned his head sadly. "But I'm not busy." "Humph," Meng Qi snorted softly. She waved the medicine knife, and the surrounding blue light faded. "Then you can go." She turned and walked forward along the stream again.
Ha ha ha.
The woman's voice rang out again. When Meng Qi was talking just now, she was actually saying something too. However, Li Che's attention was not on her at all, so he did not hear what she said clearly. At this moment, the surroundings quieted down. The woman's voice became clear again. "She's trying to provoke you. But what can you do?" She laughed happily. "You're useless. You can only drag them down. Even if you succeed in provoking me, what can you do? Silly girl." Li Che did not respond to her like before. He stood in the same place and looked at Meng Qi's back that was gradually getting farther and farther away. The green-robed woman seemed to be taller than when he first met her. Her hair was simply tied up behind her head. A jade hairpin pinned her long black hair, revealing her long and fair neck. Meng Qi did not look back again. Li Che suddenly gritted his teeth and chased after her with big strides. "Even if you chase after her, it's useless. Don't you see the situation clearly? You'll only drag them down. After all, you don't have a natural gift and your cultivation is not high. I'm a cultivator in the early stage of the spirit-severing stage. My cultivation is higher than hers." Li Che interrupted the woman for the first time. "Just a little bit higher. Even if it's just a little bit, it's still better than her being alone." Li Che walked faster and interrupted the woman again. "Just a little bit is enough. Even if it's just..." His eyes became bright. "It can only be used as a cushion under their feet, or someone needs to pick the netherworld thorn." Li Che's tone became firm. "Just a little bit is enough." As he spoke, he raised his hand. His index finger and thumb made a small, very small distance between them. "It's better to use it a little than to use it all by herself. She doesn't need a burden like you at all." The woman's voice became sharp. Li Che ignored her. The woman's voice became higher and sharper, but it seemed to be getting farther and farther away from him. Even if he could still hear it, it wouldn't make him want to run away. Li Che walked faster and soon caught up with Meng Qi and walked side by side with her. Meng Qi. He scratched his head and murmured, but he didn't know what to say. In the barrier of the Apricot Forest tournament, Meng Qi said, Senior Lin Yan gave me a medical manual.
Huh?
Li Che was stunned. He didn't know why she suddenly mentioned this. Some of her experiences are recorded in the medical manual. Meng Qi smiled at Li Che and continued, Senior Lin Yan's sect isn't a big sect.
Oh.
Li Che knew this. There wasn't a single medical cultivator in the 3,000 worlds and 4 realms who hadn't heard of the legend of the last great doctor of the ancient era. The sect that Lin Yan had come from had only been a small, unknown sect in the ancient world of cultivators, which had been filled with powerful cultivators. It wasn't even comparable to the current status of Songhai Academy. It wasn't until Lin Yan appeared that the sect gradually became one of the top medical cultivator sections. Li Che's heart skipped a beat. Meng Qi suddenly opened her hand, and a small bamboo scroll appeared in her palm. That medical manual is in my spiritual sea. I've only seen 3 scrolls so far. She handed the bamboo scroll to Li Che. The contents of the 3 scrolls are recorded here. Li Che was shocked. He didn't reach out to take it. This was passed down to you by Senior Lin Yan. I can't see it. Why can't you? Meng Qi asked in reply. This. Li Che scratched his head. Wasn't this a matter of course? The inheritance of a sect can't be casually given to outsiders. He muttered. I don't have a sect, Meng Qi said. Senior Lin Yan's sect disappeared 10,000 years ago. She asked Li Che instead, who's an outsider? Li Che was speechless. Although that was the case, this was still wrong. The medical manual that Senior Lin Yan passed down to you is equivalent to her inheritance. How can you casually give it to others? Li Che thought for a long time and could only say this. Senior Lin Yan didn't say that I can't give it to others. Meng Qi said. Before I entered 10 Extremes Mountain, I was worried that I wouldn't be able to get out and that Senior Lin Yan's inheritance would be destroyed. What about it? Li Che looked at Meng Qi. I also made a bamboo scroll like this and placed it in the Heaven and Earth Library in Heaven and Earth, Meng Qi said. Li Che was speechless. He looked at Meng Qi dumbfounded. Qing Yanzhenjun also said that it's not easy for cultivators from the 3,000 worlds to enter the Heaven and Earth Library, and there are too many bamboo scrolls. She suggested that I make a few more and put them in the auction house in Heaven and Earth. If I really can't get out of 10 Extremes Mountain, Heaven and Earth will auction off those bamboo scrolls for me in the next auction after 10 Extremes Mountain closes, so as to prevent Senior Lin Yan's inheritance from being destroyed. Meng Qi said again. Li Che was completely stunned. What? Meng Qi tilted her head slightly and looked at him. Do you think that Qing Yanzhenjun and I are wrong? No. Li Che scratched his head. But this way, won't Senior Lin Yan be angry? What kind of person is Senior Lin Yan? Meng Qi asked. Li Che was dumbfounded. She's a profound realm great doctor who will sacrifice her own Mahayana realm cultivation in order to cure cultivators and ordinary people from the 3,000 worlds. Meng Qi smiled. Do you think she cares about this? Li Che didn't say anything. Meng Qi put the bamboo scroll in his hand and said, It's a pity that I can't take the jade scroll out of the spirit sea. Otherwise, if Senior Xue Ji and the others from the Wind Alliance study it together, they'll probably be able to see all the contents of the jade scroll. Li Che was speechless. He clenched the bamboo scroll in his hand, still a little confused. He always felt that the current Meng Qi was a little different from before, but he couldn't tell exactly what was different about it. Have you always wanted to know what happened in the Starfall Sea? Meng Qi said. Yes. Li Che subconsciously responded, but quickly reacted and hurriedly said, If you don't want to say it, you don't have to say it. At that time, they all fainted in the Starfall Sea and the Falling Heart Forest. No one knew what Lin Yan said, or did to Meng Qi in the end. When they woke up, they were already outside the Falling Heart Forest. In the Falling Heart Forest is indeed another wisp of Senior Lin Yan's consciousness, Meng Qi said.
Ah.
Li Che exclaimed in a small voice. Senior Lin Yan in the Apricot Forest it's all her. Meng Qi said, many ancient secret techniques have been lost. To put it simply, Senior Lin Yan had two unfulfilled wishes at that time. First, she hasn't passed on what she learned in her life, so she used a secret technique to leave a wisp of consciousness in the apricot forest tournament boundary to find a successor. Li Che nodded thoughtfully. The other unfulfilled wish is because of Senior Lin Yan's Taoist companion, Meng Qi said. That's Senior's? Li Che asked carefully. Lin Yan was the last mysterious realm doctor in the ancient times. She was the medical cultivator who had the most hope to become a great doctor. Li Che wasn't a gossipy person, but he had heard too much about Lin Yan.
Yes.
Meng Qi nodded. I only heard from Master that Senior Lin Yan had a Taoist companion. The two of them had a very close relationship. That senior was also a Taoist expert, but unfortunately, she also died later. At the end of the ancient times, the Zionist world was divided into three parts: the 3,000 worlds, the demon world, and the devil world. In that cataclysm that tore apart the heavens and earth, too many Taoist talents and experts died. As a result, many inheritances were cut off. The Zionists gradually declined, and it was difficult for them to regain their glory in the ancient times. Even the Falling Star Pavilion, Moon Mirror Sky, Broken Space Sect, Wind Alliance, and other ancient sects from 10,000 years ago only had 10 or 20% of their inheritances left. If it wasn't for the fact that the demon world and the demon world suffered equally heavy losses, and that each world was protected by a powerful boundary when the three realms were formed, the 3,000 worlds would have been destroyed. Even if there were cracks in the boundary, those demonic cultivators with too high a cultivation level couldn't enter the 3,000 worlds through the boundary. Otherwise, the 3,000 worlds would have been swallowed by the demon world.
Yes.
Meng Qi nodded. In order to save those people who were injured by the demonic cultivators, Senior Lin Yan damaged her own cultivation and fell from the Mahayana realm to the insightful Void realm. It was also at that time that her Taoist companion was attacked by several demon mansion masters in order to protect her and was seriously injured. Li Che was startled. Senior Lin Yan's Taoist companion died before her. This was something everyone knew. However, no one knew how he died. Meng Qi continued, if Senior Lin Yan didn't damage her own cultivation to save her Taoist companion, she could have saved him no matter how seriously injured he was. However, at that time, she said softly, her cultivation level had already fallen to the insightful Void realm. She knew how to save her seriously injured Taoist companion, but she couldn't do anything. Li Che exclaimed softly again. He was also a medical cultivator. He understood how it felt to be helpless to save someone you loved. It felt like there was a way, but you could only watch as the other person was seriously injured. Li Che was silent for a while. Then, he said, if it were me, I would probably still be brooding over it. Therefore, Senior Lin Yan's other unfulfilled wish was to save her Taoist companion, Meng Qi said. Then Li Che muttered, she's in the Starfall Sea. Do you know why Senior Lin Yan planted so many falling heart trees, and why she extracted spirit chi from all the cultivators who entered the forest? Li Che shook his head. It's rumored that demonic cultivators have a way to revive people by using falling heart trees and spell formations. Ah! Li Che was stunned. Even a Mahayana medical cultivator, might not be able to revive someone who is already dead. This was no longer going against the heavens. This was simply he didn't know what to say. Before Senior Lin Yan died, she received a spell formation from a demonic cultivator. That wisp of consciousness was left in the Starfall Sea. She planted falling heart trees according to the spell formation and collected falling heart trees from the cultivators who entered the forest by mistake. It was all to revive her Taoist companion who died because of her, Meng Qi said slowly. But, Li Che stopped and looked at Meng Qi in disbelief. But, this is impossible. What's impossible? What's impossible? Meng Qi suddenly curved his lips and said with a smile that wasn't a smile. That's right.
If she died, she died.
Li Che scratched his head. She died and came back to life. Meng Qi's hands, which were hanging by his side, suddenly clenched tightly and then slowly loosened. Then did Senior Lin Yan succeed? Li Che asked.
No.
Meng Qi shook his head. She gave up.
Why?
Li Che suddenly reacted. She gave up? Didn't she fail? Because Senior Lin Yan only had a wisp of remnant soul left. If she had a Mahayana cultivation base in her heyday, it wouldn't be impossible. But at that time, she could only make her Taoist companion a puppet in the maze of falling heart trees, like a living dead. It wouldn't be impossible. Li Che's lips trembled slightly, and he repeated Meng Qi's words in disbelief. He suddenly knew why he felt that Meng Qi had changed. After coming out of the Starfall Sea, Meng Qi became more determined. He no longer spoke and did things as casually as before, as if he didn't care about anything. So, Li Che murmured, is it really possible? Coming back to life? Yes. Meng Qi's voice was slightly hoarse. If Senior Lin Yan still had a Mahayana cultivation base, she would be able to use heaven and earth as a formation and all her cultivation base in exchange for a chance to come back to life. And then? Li Che asked. Life for life. Meng Qi said slowly, almost word by word. Li Che looked at Meng Qi in a daze. Both of them had stopped. He actually didn't know why Meng Qi suddenly said this to him. After coming out of the Starfall Sea, Meng Qi never mentioned what happened at that time. Meng Qi. He called her in a low voice. The woman in the green robe stood in front of him. Her eyes were still clear and determined, but her eyes were slightly red. Not only were Meng Qi's eyes red, but even the tip of his nose was slightly red. Meng Qi. Li Che called again. So, Meng Qi looked at Li Che. We must go out. She turned her gaze to the distance and looked at the seemingly endless sky and wilderness. She said firmly, word by word, we must break this 7 emotions formation and climb to the peak of Shijue Mountain. I can do it, and so can you. Meng Qi looked at him. Li Che, help me. Okay. Li Che responded in a daze. Meng Qi closed her eyes. When she opened them again, the tears and red eyes just now seemed to be just Li Che's illusion. She was that calm green-robed medical cultivator again. Meng Qi reached out to touch her storage brocade bag and said, I still have some magic weapons here. She picked 3 or 4 things that they might use and gave them to Li Che. Then, she gave him some spirit stones and said, don't worry about the magic weapons at the critical moment. I still have more.
Okay.
Li Che took the magic weapons that he had never seen before. Let's go. Meng Qi said.
Okay.
Li Che nodded. He suddenly realized that although the woman in his ear was still talking, her voice was getting farther and farther away from him. It was also getting softer and softer. He almost couldn't hear what the other party was saying. I guess that every stage of the 7 emotions formation will be based on one of the emotions. The woman who talked to me just now has been trying to make me afraid. Meng Qi said. But aren't you afraid at all? Li Che thought for a while. That was true. That person's words poked at the deepest fear in his heart. Every word poked at him painfully. Yes, I'm afraid too, Meng Qi said. Li Che pursed his lips. Why did it sound like she was comforting him? Really? Meng Qi added.
Oh.
Li Che nodded. He had always been open-minded. Even though he felt his face heat up when he thought of his sorry state just now, but he didn't take it to heart. 7 emotions formation flower. Li Che raised his head slightly to look at the sky and recalled seriously, according to what you said, the formation can amplify the effect of the medicine. Then how are we going to break through this stage? He didn't understand formations and guessed randomly. Do we have to find the eye of the formation and destroy it? It shouldn't be that simple. Meng Qi said, formations usually need Ling energy to maintain. Just like the defensive formation of the Earth Barracks. It needs Xiuzhe to continuously pour in Ling energy before it can be used. It's the same when you use Ling stones? Li Che asked.
Yes.
Meng Qi nodded. Just now, that person wanted to make us afraid. Now that we're not afraid anymore, do we just have to wait for the Ling energy to run out and then we'll pass? Li Che asked again. I'm afraid it's not that easy. Meng Qi smiled. It's in the 10 Extremes Mountains. Even though I don't know what method it used, it's probably not lacking in Ling energy. She pointed at her feet. To be able to grow so many exotic flowers and herbs, there must be enough Ling energy. That's true. Li Che nodded. Maybe. Meng Qi lowered her head and pondered for a moment. We can try.
How do we try?
Li Che was stunned. Elder. Meng Qi suddenly looked in front and asked, Are you still there? Who are you talking to? Li Che was shocked and quickly looked around.
Elder?
Meng Qi called again. The elder who spoke just now. Are you still there? Li Che. He was stunned for a moment before he suddenly reacted. Are you talking to the senior, who scared us?
Yes.
Meng Qi nodded. But she. Li Che was puzzled. That person was simply trying to poke at the weakest part of his heart. Now that he thought about it, he still felt sad. Even if she's still here, she won't help us, right? We're still in the 10 Extremes Mountains. Meng Qi said, since the 10 Extremes Mountains is a test, these elders are actually the same as Elder Lin Yan in the Apricot Forest competition. They're not deliberately making things difficult for us, they're just testing us. Li Che. He still didn't quite believe it. At this moment, Li Che only felt his vision blur, and a big rock suddenly appeared in front of him. A girl in red was sitting sideways on the rock. Her snow-white bare feet were swaying, and her glossy black hair was braided into 2 braids that hung over her shoulders. The girl slightly raised her head, and her small and delicate chin and white neck formed a beautiful arc. Her nose bridge was tall, and her eyebrows were picturesque. The sun shone on the side of her face, and her skin was even more delicate. Just the side of her face was so beautiful that people couldn't take their eyes off her. Even a gentleman like Li Che couldn't help but stare blankly at her. However, he quickly looked away and didn't dare to stare at the girl in red for too long. Just by looking at her appearance, the girl in red seemed to be even younger than Meng Qi and Xikong Xing. Li Che obviously knew that even an infant in the 10 Extremes Mountains would be their great elder. Elder. Meng Qi respectfully bowed. What's the matter? The girl in red wrinkled her nose and snorted softly. Her voice was pleasing to the ear, and there was a hint of coquettishness. She seemed to be quite dissatisfied with Meng Qi not taking the bait. Elder, please enlighten me. The first test. Meng Qi said in a neither servile nor overbearing manner. The girl in red chuckled. I told you, you're an interesting little girl. She gently swayed her feet, looked at Meng Qi and said, I've never seen a girl like you. Li Che could clearly hear her laughter. She was indeed the woman who had been nagging beside his ear, the woman who had almost caused him to break down. As the girl in red spoke, she turned her head to look at Meng Qi. Her side face was already beautiful, and her face was even more beautiful. Especially those eyes. They were as bright as the stars in the night sky, and as clear and mysterious as the mountains and lakes shrouded in clouds and mist. Li Che didn't dare to blaspheme her. His gaze quickly turned away and fell on the grass at his feet. Meng Qi raised his head and looked into the girl's eyes. The girl in red rolled her eyes and smiled like a blooming flower. It's not impossible to tell you, but she stretched out her snow-white hand, gently held her chin, and looked at Meng Qi with a smile. You have to tell me why you're not affected by me at all. Little girl, do you really have nothing to be afraid of? I'm afraid. Meng Qi's tone was flat, and it sounded like she was comforting Li Che just now. Humph. The girl in red snorted again. I'm afraid. She made a face at Meng Qi. Only that silly guy will believe you. The girl in red looked at Meng Qi with interest. I think I guessed your thoughts correctly, but why are you not affected at all? Meng Qi thought for a moment. Elder's guess is very accurate. The girl in red wrinkled her nose at her. Then why are you not affected at all? Because I've experienced things that are even more terrifying and frightening. Meng Qi smiled. Then I'm not afraid of other things. Humph. The girl in red jumped up. That's as good as not saying anything. There are things that are even more terrifying and frightening to you? Did you almost die? BQGXSYDW. Kamshi counted with her fingers. That shouldn't be. You went through the tribulation very smoothly, and you weren't seriously injured. You're also a medical cultivator. Forget it. She waved her hand. I like you, and so does Yen. You answered this question correctly.
Thank you, Elder.
Meng-Chi bowed to her. The girl in red clapped her hands and said, You saw it? She pointed to the stream on the side and said, Stardust Stone.
It's really Stardust Stone.
Li Che immediately forgot about everything else and turned to look at the stream. Yes, yes. The girl in red nodded repeatedly. Stardust Stone, Nether River, Netherworld Spike. You're right. She smiled like a flower. You two are not bad. Li Che blushed and bowed as well. Thank you, Elder. What are you thanking me for? The girl in red giggled. I haven't finished yet. She continued. Although the Nether River flows endlessly, it can freeze everything. She said, it will freeze everything it touches, including flesh, blood, meridians, and spiritual energy. It will make you feel so much pain that you want to die. Trust me, you don't want to experience that kind of pain. Netherworld Spike. You're partly right. Netherworld Spike and Stardust Stone can indeed reconstruct the inner core. However, the girl in red waved her hand, and a pair of gloves as thin as cicada's wings appeared in her fair and slender palm. TSK, TSK, TSK. She looked at the gloves and shook her head with a sigh. This thing is like picking up the Netherworld Spike. Fortunately, you didn't act impulsively. Otherwise, you would have died if you touched it. Meng-Chi. Li Che. There are indeed small thorns as thin as cow's hair on the back of the Netherworld Spike, and the girl in red laughed. These thorns can pierce through anything. Even if you use a medicinal knife to pick up the Netherworld Spike, the small thorns will enter your skin through the medicinal knife in the blink of an eye. Also, she smiled and shook a finger. It's not 10 breaths, it's 3 breaths. 3 breaths can kill insightful truth cultivators. In this world, only Mahayana cultivators can pick up the Netherworld Spike and live. Li Che sucked in a breath of cold air. To them, the Netherworld Spike was something that only existed in legends. He had only seen it in books. Alright, as for the other flowers and plants, you probably won't be able to use them. The girl in red said, These 2 children are not bad. They found the things you need to pass the first test at a glance. She waved her hand as she spoke, and another person suddenly appeared on the grass. Yen Xian. Li Che exclaimed. Yen Xian. Meng-Chi's tone was slightly calmer. When the girl in red introduced the Stardust Stone and the Netherworld Spike, she already had a premonition of what the other party would ask them to do. Don't say that we're bullying you. The girl in red smiled as she looked at the 2 of them. Her gaze was incomparably beautiful. Since you 2 are medical cultivators, then the first test will be on your profession. She pointed at Yen Xian, who was lying on the ground, and said, This is also your partner. His inner core is damaged. Since you have the Netherworld Spike and the Stardust Stone here, in that case, you should heal his injuries. The girl in red smiled and said, When his inner core is repaired, you will pass the first test. You have 3 days. The girl in red smiled. If you can't heal him in 3 days, you will have failed the first test. You will have to stay in the 7 emotions formation of the 10 Extremes Mountains, and none of you will be able to leave. She paused, and her gaze fell on Meng-Chi's face. Xiao Yan likes you so much, and it's rare that you understand Xiao Yan. Senior will help you again. The girl in red smiled. Although 7 people can enter the 7 emotions formation, it doesn't say that 7 people have to leave. To break the formation, you only need to pass the 7 tests. Even if there is only 1 person left, you have passed the 7 emotions formations test. At that time, she smiled sweetly. You will only be 1 step away from the 10 Extremes Mountains. Little friend. The girl in red's eyes were incomparably bright, and her cheeks were slightly red. She looked at Li Che as if she was implying something. What did you say just now? Dear best. Amidst her light laughter, the girl in red and the big rock she was sitting on disappeared. The field returned to its tranquility, and only the sound of the wind and the flowing of the creek could be heard. Meng-Chi and Li Che looked at each other. Li Che furrowed his brows. What she meant by that sentence, let's go see Yen Xian first. Meng Qi finished speaking and walked towards Yan Xian. Meng Qi. Li Che stood in place without moving. We all know what happened to Yan Xian's injury. Now that we have the Netherworld Thorn and the Stardust Stone, he can be cured. He said, the only problem is the Stardust Stone and the Netherworld Thorn. Li Che finished speaking and smiled slightly. He looked at Meng Qi and said, this senior has already said it very clearly, as long as I go and pluck. Li Che. Meng Qi turned to look at him. Do you really believe what she said?
Ah.
Li Che didn't understand. But didn't you say that they are all seniors, and this is just a test? That's right. Meng Qi nodded. But from the moment we entered the 10 Extremes Mountains, most of the words they said to us were lies,
she said.
Chapter 171. Huh. Li Che didn't understand. You mean, she's lying to us? He was a bit confused. Then you mean that our first test isn't this, we need to do something else. Yan Xian. Li Che looked at Yan Xian lying on the grass. Is it to confuse us? Let's take a look at Yan Xian first. Meng Qi continued to walk towards Yan Xian.
Okay.
Li Che also slowly followed. The black-robed man lying on the grass had his eyes closed. His thick eyelashes drooped down, casting a small shadow under his eyes, making his handsome face look sickly pale. Yan Xian's lips were also very white, without a trace of blood. His slender hands were at his side, his fingers slightly curled. His fingernails also had no trace of blood. Meng Qi and Li Che crouched down beside Yan Xian. She first reached out her hand and pressed it on the head of the unconscious black-robed youth. A strand of Ling energy flowed through Yan Xian's forehead and into his body. Even though she had already guessed what kind of chaotic and desolate situation Yan Xian's body would be, when Meng Qi's spiritual awareness followed her Ling energy and really saw Yan Xian's Ling Si, she was still stunned. Yan Xian's Ling Si was very large and deep. The amount of Ling energy a Xiuzha had was related to the size and depth of the Ling Si. At the same Xiuzha level, talented Xiuzha's Ling Si would often be larger and deeper than normal Xiuzha, allowing it to contain more Ling energy. When a Xiuzha level increases, the amount of Ling energy will also increase. Advancing from the nascent soul stage to the spirit-severing stage would cause one's spirit Si to become deeper. For small realms of the same level, for example, from Yuanying early stage to Yuanying middle stage, then to Yuanying late stage, and then to the Great Circle, every time the Xiuzha level increases, the Ling Si will become larger. With the accumulation of differences, the Ling Si of talented Xiuzha will naturally become larger and deeper. Zhuji and Jindan may not be so obvious. When it comes to Yuanying and divinity level, the advantages of young talented Xiuzha will gradually become obvious. After all, in the 3,000 worlds, no matter which school of cultivation you belong to, spiritual energy is the most basic and the most important. Meng Qi's divine sense had already been sent into the unconscious Yan Xian's body along with her spiritual energy. This was not the first time she had seen the spirit ocean of the Jade Face Pavilion. However, it was so vast and unparalleled. It was as vast as the Jade Face Sea when one was at the peak of the Jade Face Pavilion. Every time she saw the boundless spirit ocean, she would still feel extremely shocked. Meng Qi was a medical xiu and had seen the Ling Seas of many Xiuzha. From her previous life to this life, the spiritual seas of all the cultivators she had seen, including Pei Mufeng, Qin Xiuma, Chu Tianfeng, and other talented cultivators, were not as good as Yan Xian's. What's wrong? Li Che saw that she was in a daze and reached out to check Yan Xian's pulse. Actually, even if a Xiuzha was unconscious, Ling energy would subconsciously protect its master. Yan Xian was an exception. His internal Dan was damaged, and the remaining Ling energy was no different from that of a normal Zhuji Xiuzha. Li Che's divine sense was the same as Meng Qi's, entering his body without any obstruction. Li Che gave a small exclamation. Clearly, he had seen Yan Xian's Ling Si. Such a vast and unparalleled Ling Sea was also filled with scars and dried up like the bottom of a lake that had been forgotten by the world for tens of thousands of years. The bottom of the Ling Sea was filled with crisscrossing cracks. Even if there was Ling energy, it would probably all flow through these cracks. All Xiuzha above the stage of Jindan would have an internal Dan slowly spinning above their Ling Sea, continuously replenishing Ling energy for the Ling Sea. The internal Dan was endless. As long as the Xiuzha was alive, it would continuously produce new Ling energy. Ling energy nourished and widened the Ling Sea, and the Ling Sea stored Ling energy. When the Ling Sea widened to a certain size, the Xiuzha's cultivation would increase. However, Yan Xian's internal Dan was already damaged. It wasn't damaged, it wasn't useless, it was completely destroyed. The space above Yan Xian's Ling Sea was empty, and there was no internal Dan at all. He was originally a spell Xiu. The life-bound talisman of a spell Xiu would also float above the Ling Sea after it was forged, and be nourished by Ling energy, just like Meng Qi's life-bound cauldrons. But even now, his life-bound talisman, the crescent moon, was only floating above the Ling Sea. It didn't seem to have any light, as though it would fall to the bottom of the sea in the next moment and completely shatter. Meng Qi took back his hand and raised his head to look at Li Che. At the same time, Li Che also raised his head to look at him. The two silently exchanged a look and saw a hint of sadness in each other's eyes. Yan Xian. Li Che was probably shocked by Yan Xian's Ling Sea and said carefully, "He was really strong in the past, right?" Meng Qi nodded and said, "He was the #1 genius of the same level. Yes, I also heard from my master that he was the #1 cultivator of the younger generation. His father, the leader of Jinghua Heaven, had high hopes for him and hoped that he could make spell Xiu as strong as it was 10,000 years ago. I also heard from my master that..." Li Che thought for a while and said, "His cultivation level is already close to that of the elders of Jinghua Heaven Gate, especially his talent in cultivating spells. It was said that he was able to complete some of the incomplete spells that had been passed down to him. Such a Xiu should have really become a strong cultivator of the same generation and had a chance to ascend to the Mahayana realm. But unfortunately," Li Che sighed softly, "is it because the heavens are jealous of the talented?" "Yes," Meng Qi said. Li Che was just speaking from the bottom of his heart, and he didn't expect to receive such a firm answer from Meng Qi. He couldn't help but scratch his head and said, "Yan Xian was injured because he tried to stop the demonic Xiu?" "Yes." Meng Qi nodded. She narrowed her eyes slightly, and her spirit energy had already circled around Yan Xian's body. Other than his spiritual sea, she also checked the meridians and blood vessels of his limbs clearly. She stood up and silently paced back and forth around Yan Xian. Li Che also stood up and said, "The cracks in Yan Xian's spiritual sea, especially the bottom of his spiritual sea. Did you notice that the cracks on the bottom of the left side of his spiritual sea are very neat, and don't look like cracks that dry and form without the nourishment of spirit energy? It looks like he was injured by an external force, and it is a very sharp external force." Meng Qi stopped and said, "Yes." Li Che nodded. "It is dense and sharp, and it can leave such a scar on the bottom of the spiritual sea." He said, "What is this? Is it a spell of the demonic Xiu or a demonic martial art?" "I'm guessing that the regression of Yan Xian's cultivation has something to do with the injury at the bottom of his spiritual sea. Otherwise, he would at most lack of spirit energy, and his cultivation wouldn't have regressed," Meng Qi said.
"Oh."
Li Che nodded. "It's not just the bottom of the spiritual sea, there are very small wounds on his meridians as well." Meng Qi continued, "The small ones look like they were cut by a very narrow and sharp knife along the sides of his meridians. His inner core is shattered, but it was shattered so thoroughly that not even a trace was left." Meng Qi started pacing back and forth again. In her previous life, she had healed Yan Xian's injuries. That wasn't right. She hadn't completely healed Yan Xian's injuries, and she still needed the Netherworld spike. However, she had obtained the Stardust Stone at that time, and she had thought of a way to repair the cracks in Yan Xian's spiritual sea. She had also thought of a way to repair his inner core. Although it was very difficult, Yan Xian was still able to use spirit energy, and his cultivation had almost recovered. However, he couldn't fight with others too often, and he definitely couldn't exhaust his spirit energy. Otherwise, his spiritual sea and inner core would easily collapse. This was because Meng Qi didn't have the Netherworld spike at that time. She had coincidentally arrived in the demon realm and was looking for the Netherworld River to see if she could find the Netherworld spike and come back to heal Yan Xian. She had died in the demon realm. Now they had the Stardust Stone and the Netherworld spike with them, and it seemed like they could heal him. However, Yan Xian's injuries were much more serious than what Meng Qi had seen in her previous life. In her previous life, Yan Xian's inner core only had cracks, and they were still above his spiritual sea. However, this time, his inner core was completely gone. In her previous life, Yan Xian's spiritual sea didn't have so many cracks, and there were only a few cracks on the walls of his spiritual sea. The Stardust Stone in Meng Qi's hand was more than enough to repair those cracks. However, Yan Xian's inner core was completely destroyed in front of them, and it had directly disappeared. His spiritual sea was full of cracks, and there were so many cracks that Meng Qi even felt that if she exerted a little bit of force on Yan Xian's spiritual sea, his spiritual sea would directly collapse. The Stardust Stone in her storage bag couldn't even repair 1/10 of the cracks in his spiritual sea, right? Meng Qi couldn't help but smile bitterly, and her gaze drifted to the cheerfully flowing stream. Who would have thought that the clear and harmless stream water was actually the river Styx that could freeze all living things? How is it? Li Che asked. I'm afraid this Stardust Stone isn't enough. Meng Qi flipped her hand and took out her own Stardust Stone. Her Stardust Stone wasn't much bigger than a fist, and the stone flickered with faint starlight, and it looked quite bright. But now, compared to the Stardust Stone at the bottom of the stream, it seemed a little dim. The Stardust Stone in the stream, separated by the clear and flowing stream, seemed to have fragments of gold glittering at the bottom of the stream, as if there was an endless river of stars flowing there. In other words, we need more Stardust Stones. Li Che's tone became calm. Then we can only get them from there. He turned his head to look at the Netherworld River. Looking at the clear stream, he thought of the records and legends about the Netherworld River in the books. Meng Qi. Li Che's gaze moved from the stream to Meng Qi's face. Now, I have a question. Which comes first, the Stardust Stone or the Netherworld Spike? Let's first discuss how to treat a damaged cultivator's dantian. Meng Qi carefully looked around her and then sat down cross-legged. She couldn't help it. There were spiritual flowers and spiritual herbs everywhere. If she wasn't careful, she could sit down on several spiritual herbs that were already extinct in the 3,000 worlds. Okay. Li Che did the same as her. He first looked around and then chose a spot to sit down cross-legged. He took out a bamboo scroll and casually threw it into the air. His finger tapped lightly, and a wisp of spiritual energy was sent into the bamboo scroll. Meng Qi did the same. This way, both of them could write on the bamboo scroll and also see what the other person wrote. Master once mentioned that when a cultivator's spiritual sea or inner core is damaged, Stardust Stones are needed to repair it. It's slightly easier to repair the spiritual sea. Stardust Stones, spirit-devouring grass, nightless fruit, 5 spiritual flowers, and Taishan wood. Medical practitioners use the cold spring spiritual due to refined starlight. When the starlight is placed into the spiritual sea, even without the help of medical practitioners, the spiritual sea can slowly repair itself. Li Che said, although these things are rare, they're still found in the 3 realms. Other than Taishan wood, which is only found in the Starfall Sea, the other 3 spiritual herbs and spiritual flowers can also be found in the 3,000 worlds. In the south, there are nightless fruit and 5 spiritual flowers. However, if the inner core is damaged, the cultivator's foundation will be damaged. The starlight cannot repair the damaged inner core. Only the Netherworld Thorn can regenerate the damaged inner core. Li Che continued, the Netherworld Thorn has been missing in the 3,000 worlds for thousands of years. My master has only seen it in the sex records. He smiled bitterly. Master has never mentioned how to use it. Li Che paused, and then said, however, I have seen the records of the Netherworld Thorn in the Sex records. Other than regenerating the inner core, it is said that the Netherworld Thorn can also heal all kinds of injuries. No matter how serious the injury, adding a leaf of the Netherworld Thorn in the medicine can also bring a cultivator back to life. He thought seriously and then said, I don't know anything else. As Li Che spoke, he recorded everything he knew on the bamboo slip and then looked at Meng Qi. When he mentioned medical skills, the fear in his eyes completely disappeared and became clear and calm again. He became the medical cultivator Li Che, who only knew how to save people on the city wall. The Netherworld Thorn. Meng Qi said, it is said that in the 3 realms, only the demon world has it. Li Che's eyes lit up. It still exists in the demon world? It is said that when the river Styx was cut off, it went from the top to the bottom. Is it really preserved in the demon world?
Oh.
Meng Qi didn't know. She heard that the Netherworld Thorn existed in the demon world, but she didn't see it with her own eyes. Li Che couldn't help but rub his hands together excitedly. I've heard from Master that many of the spiritual herbs that only existed in the 3,000 realms were destroyed in the chaos of war. However, there are still some left in the Devil Realm and the Demon Realm. I don't know when I can go to the Demon World and the Demon World to take a look. He looked at the silent Meng Qi and was a little embarrassed. Go on, I am too excited. Meng Qi shook his head slowly and continued, I have only seen records of it in books, but I have never seen it with my own eyes whether the Demon World has the River Styx and the Netherworld Thorn. Yes. Li Che only nodded this time. The Netherworld Thorn, Nirvana Fruit, Misty Flower, and 5 elements Flame and Stardust Stone are used to refine them. Finally, you can get the Star Sand. Meng Qi continued. Wait. Li Che's eyes lit up. Star Sand. Is it really Star Sand? Star Sand. Meng Qi nodded. Starlight can repair the spiritual sea, and Star Sand can repair the inner core. Li Che suddenly stood up and paced back and forth. Star Sand, he muttered and continued. 11 years ago, when I was still young, I followed my master to participate in the Medical Cultivator Alliance Conference for the first time. Yes, at that time, my master was not the sect master, and the one who brought us to the Medical Cultivator Alliance Conference was my grandmaster. I was lucky enough to listen to my master and several seniors chatting, and I heard them mention Starlight. Then one of the seniors asked, since Starlight exists in the world, what about Star Sand? Li Che looked at Meng Qi. Later, several seniors had their own opinions and argued endlessly. Some of them thought that since Starlight exists, Star Sand should also exist. However, some seniors thought that since no one has seen Star Sand since ancient times, Star Sand is something that only exists in theory. Meng Qi. He was a little excited. Does Star Sand really exist? I don't know. Meng Qi said, I have only seen records of Star Sand in books, so I am not sure whether it exists or not. What book, Meng Qi? Li Che jumped in front of Meng Qi and asked curiously. Oh, Meng Qi thought for a while and said, there is a Tiandi study house in Outland. Haven't you been there? Tiandi study house? Li Che gasped. It sounds like a place that I can't go. Is it on the Tiandi auction island? No, it's in Outland City. Meng Qi said, but it's in a corner of the city, and it's relatively remote. There shouldn't be many people there, but there are a lot of books. You have to choose carefully. She thought for a while and said, the owner of the study house seems to accept all kinds of books, including books from all 3 realms. Also, there are rumors in the marketplace, strange stories, everything, and the quantity is very large. So powerful. Li Che couldn't help but sigh. The next time I go to Outland, I must go and take a look. Li Che looked at Meng Qi and asked again, are the books there for sale? No, you can only read them there. Meng Qi said, and the owner of the study house doesn't accept spirit stones. You have to exchange spirit points. Spirit points? Li Che gasped. You can exchange spirit points for a chance to read there? Meng Qi, did you hear it wrong? Is it really spirit points? Yes. Meng Qi nodded with certainty. You can also record the things that only you know into a book and give it to the owner of the study house. You can get some spirit points. If someone else borrows the book that you contributed, you will be able to obtain a copy of the book. You will also be able to get some spirit points. Meng Qi simply told Li Che everything he knew about the Tiandi study house. Exchange spirit points. You can get some spirit points. Li Che was stunned when he heard it. He looked at Meng Qi in disbelief. Meng Qi, are you sure you didn't hear it wrong? Spirit points? Not spirit stones? 1200 KSW, net Meng Qi. Meng Qi? Li Che walked around her a few times, then stood still and said seriously, do you know that in Outland, spirit points are more valuable than spirit stones? No. He didn't wait for Meng Qi to speak and shook his head first. He said, it's not valuable, it's just, how do I put it? Li Che scratched his head. For example, if some heavenly materials and earthly treasures can be bought with spiritual stones, then I might be able to use spiritual points to exchange for them. Meng Qi? Li Che continued, I heard from my master that if our sect wants to open a shop in Outland City, then we need spirit points every month. Spirit points can't be exchanged with spirit stones, so we can only exchange them for spirit points by making some contributions to Outland City. Of course, if we want to open a shop on the floating island of Outland City, then we need even more spirit points. He added, how much do you need? Meng Qi asked. In Outland City, opening a shop requires 15 spirit points a month. If it's on the floating island, then it requires 50 spirit points a month. That's good, Meng Qi said. Borrowing a book from the Tiandi study house doesn't require much spirit points. It only costs 10 spirit points. 10 spirit points. Only? Li Che stared at Meng Qi for a moment and smiled bitterly. There were several times when our Songhai College almost couldn't maintain the shop on the floating island, you know? Only the top 10 sects of the 4 realms can go to the shop on the floating island. Li Che continued, if you want to participate in the exploration of the mountains around Outland City, you also need spirit points. So 10 spirit points really isn't a small amount. If you only want to borrow a book and we don't know what the book is talking about, I think many cultivators won't be willing to do it. Li Che finally said,
Oh.
Meng Qi lowered her head and thought about it. She seemed to have a lot of spirit points, so she never felt that spirit points were hard to earn. Ah, I seem to have gone off topic. Li Che smiled at Meng Qi embarrassedly. After all, he was still young and hadn't interfered with the management of the sex shop in Outland City. So even if he knew that spirit points were rarer than spirit stones in Outland City, he didn't have any other thoughts. If Shuecheng Xian was here, the future sect master of the Wind Alliance would be completely different. Li Che quickly turned the topic back to repairing the inner core. The book says that one can repair the inner core. Then, what about Yan Xian's situation where his inner core is completely damaged? Meng Qi narrowed her eyes, and the injuries to his meridians and spiritual seed.
Yes.
Li Che nodded. Yan Xian has been injured for more than a year. The injuries to his spiritual sea and inner core can't be treated, but the injuries to his meridians shouldn't be difficult to treat. Why hasn't he recovered? Mirror Moon Sky is in the West Realm, and the Wind Alliance is in the West Realm. Yan Xian was injured while protecting the West Realm, and he's the only son of the Mirror Moon Sky sect master. For his sake, the Wind Alliance has to do their best to treat Yan Xian. The inner core can't do much, but they don't have Stardust Stones. The injuries to his meridians can't be helped. Li Che said, could it be that there's something we haven't discovered? After he finished speaking, he walked back to Yan Xian's side and half knelt. Li Che took out a palm-sized jade pendant from his storage brocade bag. The jade pendant was carved out of yellow jade with a hollow center. It was carved into the shape of a wave. Just a few strokes. It looked simple, but ancient. This is the Azure Sea Jade pendant that Shizhuan gave me before I came to Mirror Moon Sky City. Li Che said, it was left by the elders of the sect thousands of years ago. It can be used to see the condition of a cultivator's meridians and spirit energy. Meng Qi knelt on the other side of Yan Xian. He took the Azure Sea Jade pendant from Li Che and looked at it. The Azure Sea Jade pendant needs to be used with the Azure Sea art. This is a secret of the sect. Li Che took back the jade pendant and said, "When Shizun gave me the jade pendant, he also taught me the Azure Sea art." As Li Che spoke, he put the jade pendant on Yan Xian's chest. His right hand pressed together and pointed at Yan Xian's forehead. A faint light came from the jade pendant and covered Yan Xian's entire body. Li Che closed his eyes. A moment later, fine beads of sweat appeared on his forehead. After about 15 minutes, he took back his finger and slowly exhaled. His face was much paler than before. A few strands of hair were soaked with sweat and stuck to his bloodless face. Li Che's arm trembled slightly, as though he wanted to take the Azure Sea Jade pendant. However, his body swayed and he fell backwards, landing on his butt on the grass. Meng Qi knew at a glance that he had used up all of his spirit energy. She hurriedly handed over 2 North Deep Dan. When Li Che recovered slightly, she asked, "How is it?" Even in the southern border where medical shio was rare, these large sects that had been passed down for thousands of years always had some secret methods and talismans that outsiders did not know. All of the meridians in his body were cut off inch by inch, but they were forcefully reconnected. However, the reconnection was very rough, so it looks like there are many narrow wounds made by sharp blades. Li Che swallowed the North Deep Dan and struggled to sit up. His Ling Si was completely shattered before and was reconnected using the same method. That is why there are so many neat cracks. Meng Qi stilled. Li Che's voice was slightly hoarse. What shattered his Ling Si should have been countless sharp blades. His tone suddenly became low. That is to say, someone cut Yan Xian's Ling Si into pieces and cut off his meridians inch by inch. Meng Qi's eyes suddenly widened. Li Che's tone became even more bitter. Were they purposefully torturing him? Normal Xiozha would feel unbearable pain when a small crack appeared in their Ling Si. Meng Qi could not imagine what kind of pain it would be if one's spiritual Si was shredded into pieces. For Xiozha, that was probably something even more painful than having one's flesh cut off piece by piece. Not to mention the meridians. So what really happened back then? Li Che murmured. It was unknown if he was asking Meng Qi or talking to himself. Ruegua's inner Dan was cracked due to exhaustion, but his Ling Si and meridians should not have such wounds. Also, if Ruegua was treated by a medical shio, it would not be so rough. In other words, those Mo shio purposefully cut off his meridians and then shattered his Ling Si and then purposefully reconnected them so roughly, Meng Qi said. It should be so. Li Che lowered his eyes. He was not familiar with Yan Xian, but when he heard that he had been treated like this, he couldn't help but feel sour. I think that even Hollow Truth Xiozha would find it hard to endure such pain. They were purposefully torturing him. Meng Qi made a soft sound of agreement. A moment later, she slowly said, after he was rescued and brought back to Mirror Moon Sky, even if there were medical shio to treat him, with such injuries, they could only cut off his meridians inch by inch, then cut open his Ling Si and reconnect them. But Yan Xian's inner Dan was already destroyed, basically. Her voice was low. There is no way for him to endure such pain a second time.
Yes.
Li Che nodded. That is why Yan Xian's cultivation gradually regressed. In the end, he was even weaker than a Lianqi Xiao. Meng Qi said in a low voice. The Mo Xiao did not kill him. This kind of humiliation was more painful for him than killing him. Yes. Li Che looked down at Yan Xian, his eyes full of sympathy. He was not a genius of his generation, but he was still loved and valued by his master in Blue Sea College. Putting himself in Yan Xian's shoes, if he was treated like this, he would not be able to cultivate anymore. From being the most outstanding disciple, he would gradually fade into the crowd and even become the worst disciple in the sect. He would probably rather die. He Xian was Yan Xian. He should have been the #1 genius of his generation. He was once the only son of Mirror Moon Heaven's Gate Master. He was the true pride of the heavens. With such a huge difference, Even if his masters and fellow sect members pitied him, respected him, and treated him well, he would still feel terrible. Who knows how he endured his injuries for more than a year? So it's like this. Meng Qi murmured.
What?
Li Che did not understand. No wonder Yan Xian left Mirrormoon Heaven later on, Meng Qi said. The pity of his fellow sect members probably made him feel even more pain. Yes, but Meng Qi did not understand. Yan Xian suffered such heavy injuries and torture. Was he captured by the Mo Xiao? But didn't the rumors say that he fought for 3 days and 3 nights without giving an inch? He is the young gate master of Mirrormoon Heaven, Li Che said after being startled.
Oh.
Meng Qi nodded and said for the second time, I see. Li Che smiled bitterly and said, actually, the injuries to his spiritual sea and meridians aren't completely incurable. As long as we break his meridians inch by inch, shatter his spiritual sea, and treat him properly, his cultivation won't regress. He raised his head and met Meng Qi's black and white eyes. He said in a hoarse voice, but in the 3,000 worlds, there is probably no medical practitioner who would do that. Li Che said, because the process is too painful. His Niden was damaged. If he could not endure the pain of the treatment, he could die. After all, Yan Xian is the young master of Jinghua Heaven. Even if he is a crippled young master, if he dies, no medical cultivator or medical cultivator sect can bear the consequences. They dare not take the risk. Meng Qi. Understood, she said. Meng Qi was silent for a moment, then straightened her back and looked at Li Che. Then now, let's treat the injuries to his spiritual sea and meridians first. Are you sure? Li Che said, if he dies, he won't. Meng Qi's tone was incomparably certain.
He can.
But what if? Li Che also hesitated. There won't be a what if. Meng Qi said, if he couldn't endure such pain, he would have died under the torture of the demonic cultivators. She said, he is still alive now, so he will definitely survive. But there is no but. Meng Qi opened her hand, and a golden lotus bloomed in her palm. I have the red lotus of hellfire, she said as she put the golden lotus on Yan Xian's chest without hesitation. But it can save his life. Chapter 172. Are you going to use it? Li Che looked at the small and delicate golden lotus. Wait, he seemed to have finally reacted. This is the red lotus of hellfire. Li Che sucked in a breath of cold air. The legendary red lotus of hellfire? Yes, Meng Qi answered casually.
Can you let me see it?
Li Che's attention was immediately diverted to the lotus. As he asked, he reached out to Meng Qi. The small golden lotus was placed on his hand. Only when he was close enough could he see the almost transparent flames burning on it. The lotus was originally small, but it was cold. Holding it in his hand was like holding a piece of 1,000-year-old mysterious ice. In just a moment, it was so cold that Li Che's palm hurt. Red lotus of hellfire, he praised. According to ancient legends, this red lotus can even withstand 1/10 of the tribulation of Dongjin. Meng Qi. Li Che looked up at Meng Qi. Are you really going to use it now?
Yes.
Meng Qi answered casually. Li Che's expression was a little strange. It seemed like he was excited, but also a little reluctant. Aren't you going to save it for the tribulation in the future? He asked. My master told me that even if my cultivation level is high enough, the tribulation in the future will be harder and harder. Then I'll save it. When will I use it for the tribulation? Meng Qi smiled and asked. Li Che looked thoughtful. Of course, it's the most cost-effective to pass the tribulation of Dongjin. What if I can't even pass the tribulation of Dongjin? Meng Qi asked. What about the tribulation of Dongxiu? Li Che said. What if I can pass the tribulation of Dongjin? If I use it when I pass the tribulation of Dongjin, I'll probably be annoyed to death when I think about it when I pass the tribulation of Dongjin. This? Li Che scratched his head again. It seems quite difficult. That's why you should use it now, Meng Qi said. If you can't pass this hurdle, how can you talk about transcending the tribulation? That's true. Li Che thought for a moment and nodded heavily. Spiritual flowers, spiritual herbs, heavenly materials, and earthly treasures. No matter how good or precious they are, they have to be used up to show their value. So use it, Meng Qi said without hesitation.
Yes.
Li Che didn't say anything more. He half knelt on the other side of Yan Xian. Just like Meng Qi, he looked at the man in front of him attentively. Let's reconnect Yan Xian's meridians first. He has been injured for a long time, Meng Qi said. Now we need to reconnect all his meridians. She looked up at Li Che and said, the faster we move, the less pain he will have to suffer. Therefore, it's best to proceed with the same steps.
Yes.
When it came to treating the patient, Li Che completely stopped smiling. His expression became serious, and his eyes were extremely focused. Continuing ointment. Meng Qi took out a small box from her storage bag. 5th grade. Mine was brought out from the sect. The elders in the sect made it. Li Che also took out a box and put it on the ground. 7th grade continuing ointment. Okay. Meng Qi nodded. I'll use yours. To reconnect his meridians, in addition to the continuing ointment, you also need to use the frost silk and the continuing formula to sew up his meridians. Meng Qi said, continuing formula, 5th grade. She pointed at herself. I'm 3rd grade. Li Che blushed with shame. Meng Qi's cultivation was obviously lower than his, and the sect she came from was not as good as the Songhai Academy. However, her medical skills and cultivation were always better than his. Frost silk. Li Che thought for a while, then asked, do you have it? Meng Qi shook her head and took out a golden cocoon from her storage bag. We collected a lot of silk from the 10,000 stiff silkworm. Let's make some now.
Yes.
As Meng Qi spoke, she casually summoned her 5-spirit cauldron. Every time the 5-spirit cauldron was taken into the spirit sea and then summoned out again, it would first shake and rub against Meng Qi, then obediently hover beside her, waiting for its master's instructions. Meng Qi threw a golden cocoon into the 5-spirit cauldron. She stood up and looked around. Not far from them, there was a large area of blooming waterless flowers. They were in excellent condition. I'll go and pick some waterless flowers. Li Che jumped up and walked towards the small white flowers. He moved very quickly and soon returned with a dozen or so waterless flowers. Li Che took out a few medicinal herbs and placed them into Meng Qi's 5-spirit cauldron. Finally, he poured in a bottle of cold spring spirit dew. Meng Qi also placed a few spirit stones into the 5-spirit cauldron. Not long after, the medicinal liquid in her 5-spirit cauldron churned and completely soaked the silk from the 10,000 stiff silkworm. Li Che once again half knelt on the grass and suddenly said, frost silk can be made from ordinary silk. Of course, the silk from the 10,000 stiff silkworm is better. Yan Xian's meridians are injured, and his injuries are so serious. Of course, the frost silk made from the 10,000 stiff silkworm is better. He looked up at Meng Qi and continued, we don't usually use the frost silk, so you and I didn't prepare it. What a coincidence that we found the 10,000 stiff silkworm's silk in the 10 Extremes Mountain. Li Che muttered, why do I have a feeling that every step we take is within their calculations? Meng Qi didn't say anything. Li Che also didn't continue to speak. The two of them sat quietly on the ground and looked at Meng Qi's small cauldron. The medicinal liquid bubbled in the 5-spirit cauldron, and the silk gradually turned from gold to transparent. When the last trace of gold disappeared into the medicinal liquid, the flames in the 5-spirit cauldron were extinguished. The almost completely transparent frost silk fell into Meng Qi's palm, and a trace of icy coldness spread from her palm along the fine silk. Biddage. Calm, let's do it, Meng Qi said. Okay. Li Che nodded. Meng Qi raised her hand, and the red lotus of hellfire landed on Yan Xian's forehead. The red lotus slowly rotated, and a trace of almost transparent red flame bloomed from the red lotus and finally completely enveloped Yan Xian. Meng Qi looked up at Li Che, and the young man nodded decisively. Medical practitioners could hesitate, struggle, doubt themselves, or even be afraid at other times, but when they were treating patients, they were always very decisive. Li Che's movements were very fast. Her slender fingers started from Yan Xian's left hand and moved up along the meridians at his fingertips. Strands of spiritual energy turned into sharp blades and accurately fell on the other party's meridians, cutting the old wounds on the other party's meridians. Ugh! The unconscious black-robed young man's body suddenly bounced up. Yan Xian's eyes were still tightly closed, but small beads of sweat had already seeped out of his forehead. He was like a fish struggling on its deathbed. His waist straightened and then fell down heavily. The fingers of his hands on the side of his body curled up, as if he wanted to grab something, but in the end, he weakly let go of his hands. Meng Qi's movements were also very fast. Almost at the same time Li Che moved, she had already applied the continuity ointment on her fingers. The ice threads, along with her Ling energy, carried the slightly bitter medicinal smell of the continuity ointment and burrowed into Yan Xian's skin. Everywhere Li Che's fingers passed, Yan Xian's meridians were severed. Everywhere Meng Qi's fingers passed, the withered trees came back to life. Of course, the two had not just met, but it was the first time they had cooperated to treat a xiuzha after entering 10 Extremes Mountain. But they seemed to have cooperated like this thousands of times, and each rhythm was so seamless. Li Che would not be too slow, Meng Qi would not be too fast. The two's fingernails were neatly trimmed, their fingers long and clean. This kind of neat and coordinated movement was like a dance with a unique rhythm. The dance of the fingers. It was also a dance of medical skills. Drops of sweat gradually fell down Meng Qi's forehead. Medical spells consumed a lot of Ling energy from medical Xiao. The continuity ointment was a relatively high-level medical spell, and the Ling energy it consumed was not small for Meng Qi. What He Qiguang was trying to connect were all of Yan Xian's meridians. Xiuzha didn't just have 12 meridians, they also had 8 extra meridians. Maybe those Mo Xiao had broken all of Yan Xian's meridians in order to torture him. They had not spared a single one. Fortunately, Meng Qi was prepared and had several Northern Darkness Dan in her mouth. The effects of the Northern Darkness Dan quickly took effect, and threads of Ling energy replenished her gradually drying Ling ocean. Meng Qi and Li Che did not speak. There seemed to only be the sound of the wind and the rushing of the stream left in the world. Everything seemed so quiet and peaceful. At this time, on the cliff far away, the black-robed sword Xiao was still lazily sitting on a chair at the edge of the cliff. There was a cold smile at the corner of his mouth, causing him to look slightly evil and handsome. Behind him was the white-haired man. He stared at Meng Qi and Li Che without blinking. Not enough, the black-robed sword Xiao suddenly murmured. He stretched and said, "This little girl doesn't have enough Ling energy."
Hey.
As he spoke, he turned to look at the white-haired man, his eyes full of schadenfreude. "If we stop halfway, won't their efforts be in vain? There's a way." The white-haired man was too focused to even argue with the black-robed sword Xiao. "But, oh?" The black-robed sword Xiao asked with interest. "What way?" "She cultivates both medical and formation. If she doesn't have enough Ling energy, she can use a formation to help her recover her Ling energy," the white-haired man said, "but this is different from before when she used a formation to help decipher the Jade Scroll. Previously, her Ling energy was all used on the Jade Scroll. But if she uses the same method now, it will feel like a knife is cutting her meridians, and it will be very painful." "I know the method you're talking about, hee. The black-robed sword Xiao laughed even more happily and said with evil intentions, "This little girl looks fresh and delicate, and she's quite thin. She won't be able to endure that kind of pain." The white-haired man didn't say anything. That kind of pain is indeed unbearable. A young girl who is probably injured and still knows how to act coquettishly can endure it. Huh. The white-haired man's eyes suddenly widened. He subconsciously took a big step forward, and one of his feet was already over the edge of the cliff. The mountain wind blew at the hem of his robe, but he didn't seem to feel it at all. He was still standing firmly on the edge of the cliff, looking ahead in surprise. Even the black-robed sword Xiao suddenly sighed softly, as if he was surprised and impressed. At this moment, Meng Qi had already put down the medicine knife in her left hand. Just now, she held the medicine knife horizontally and quickly carved a formation around herself. The formation just happened to surround her in the middle. After she put down the medicine knife, she flicked out a few spirit stones. The formation that had just been drawn instantly lit up, and a few strands of spiritual energy flowed through Meng Qi's meridians into her spiritual sea. The light of the formation seemed to illuminate her eyes. Her eyes were brighter than before, but her body trembled slightly. Meng Qi's right hand was still very steady. Whether it was drawing the formation or flicking out the spirit stones, her right hand didn't tremble at all, and she repeated what she was doing. Meng Qi. Li Che quickly looked up at her. Continue. Meng Qi nodded slightly. Time seemed to have passed for a long time, but it also seemed like it was just a moment. The wind blew Meng Qi's hair, and also blew away the sweat on her forehead. Li Che's hand finally reached Yan Xian's lower abdomen. Spiritual sea. He reminded Meng Qi. Yes. The meridians finally converged into the spiritual sea, and that was the most dangerous and complicated part. Meng Qi took a deep breath, and the frost silk left deep red marks on her fingertips. There was still a small piece of the continuity ointment left. Driven by her spiritual energy, it merged into the last small piece of the frost silk. Her eyes were clear, and she couldn't see anything else in her eyes, except for the spot on her fingertips. Li Che's hand moved like the wind, and his fingers quickly moved around Yan Xian's spiritual sea. Meng Qi immediately followed, and with a light tap of her finger, the frost silk entered the man's skin along with her spiritual energy and connected his meridians one by one. Ugh! The unconscious man groaned softly, and his fingers unconsciously curled and then loosened. His black robe had long been soaked in sweat, and a few strands of black hair had condensed on the side of his face. A faint red color finally appeared on his pale face. Meng Qi looked up and fell on the grass behind her. Her entire body was completely flat, and she couldn't even move her fingers. Her meridians seemed to be cut by countless small knives, scraping through her meridians and entering her spiritual sea. The spiritual energy exchanged with spiritual stones had its own sharp force. Although it didn't leave any physical wounds, it still made her feel unbearable pain. Meng Qi. Li Che walked around Yan Xian and looked at her worriedly. Are you okay?
No.
Meng Qi really didn't have any strength left, and even speaking was difficult. North, she gasped, and her fingers moved with difficulty. North dark pill? Li Che quickly took out some elixirs. I have Little Yang Restoration Pill, which is milder than the North Dark Pill. As he spoke, he quickly put a few light blue elixirs into Meng Qi's mouth. The bitter fragrance of the medicine spread in her mouth. After a while, Meng Qi finally felt that she was alive again.
Thank you.
She struggled to sit up. Seeing this, Li Che quickly helped her up. It's still too much. Meng Qi exhaled. My cultivation is still too low. She looked down at her palm, a little annoyed. This was because they were in the 7 emotions formation, and Li Che was beside her. If they were in a different place, and there were enemies around, with her cultivation level, both of them would be finished, let alone saving people. You're already very good. A warm hand fell on Meng Qi's head. Li Che subconsciously rubbed her hair. He was not such a rash person, and he had always been polite. But just now, when he saw the usually serious face of the girl in the green robe showing such an annoyed expression, he couldn't help but want to comfort her. Really? You're much better than me. Meng Qi smiled at him and sat up. But we succeeded.
Yes.
Li Che was also happy. We succeeded. He couldn't help but recall the cooperation between the two just now. We cooperated so well. Meng Qi slowly stood up, stuffed another North Deep elixir into her mouth, and walked toward Yan Xian. I've already checked. Li Che quickly said, his meridians have been reconnected very well. It's worthy of the 5th grade continuing formula. He paused and said, when he completely absorbs the effect of the continuing ointment, his meridians will be healed.
Yes.
Meng Qi bent down and took the red lotus of hellfire from Yan Xian's forehead. The transparent flame on the red lotus became even fainter, as if it would be completely extinguished by the wind. Meng Qi was a little hesitant. Those great doctors were worried that Yan Xian, who had lost his cultivation level, would not be able to withstand the pain of reconnecting his meridians and reconstructing his spiritual sea. They were not worrying too much. The pain was indeed unbearable for ordinary people. They had the red lotus of hellfire, but they could only barely help Yan Xian get through the first stage. Then there was the spiritual sea. But could this red lotus of hellfire last until the end? Meng Qi lowered her head and looked at the red lotus of hellfire in her palm. She frowned hesitantly. If the spiritual sea also needs to be shattered and reconstructed. Li Che also realized this problem. This red lotus of hellfire, I'm afraid. Yes. Meng Qi nodded. I have to think of a way. Countless thoughts flashed through her mind. Unfortunately, there were only her and Li Che here, and they were in the 7 emotions array, which was isolated from the outside world. It was really not easy to think of a solution. Li Che also lowered his head and pondered. 9 Yang Restoration Pill. He walked slowly around Yan Xian with his hands behind his back, murmuring. Li Che quickly shook his head and denied himself. No, this is far from enough. He turned around again and looked up at Meng Qi, who was standing quietly in the same place. The girl in green had her hair tied up simply, revealing her slender neck. Meng Qi. Li Che suddenly became excited. I have an idea. Chapter 173. As Li Che spoke, he started to walk around Yan Xian while muttering, although I've never tried it before. Shizhen once told me how to use the entire secret technique. One of my grandmasters? He slowed down his steps, as if he was recalling carefully. Then he slowly said, that grandmaster of mine once successfully used this method to save his close friend who almost died. HM? Meng Qi looked at Li Che and asked, what method? Xiozhe. Li Che stood with his hands behind his back. He was wearing a blue robe and had black hair. His eyes were extremely clear as he looked at Meng Qi. He was born with a delicate and pretty face, a gentleman who was as elegant as bamboo. Right now, his eyes were clear as he looked at Meng Qi calmly. Only when a Xiozhe forms his core can he be considered to have truly stepped onto the path of cultivation. Spiritual energy is born from the Naiden and stored in the spiritual sea. Because of the Naiden, one can ensure that one's consciousness is clear and can inspect one's body. Ranwen. La Meng Qi nodded. This was a principle that all medical cultivators, or rather all Xiozhe, understood. If the Naiden is damaged, spiritual energy will not be produced, and the spiritual sea will dry up and crack. The consciousness will not be clear and will gradually be limited to chaos. Meng Qi said slowly. Yes. Li Che nodded. After forming the core, a Xiozhe's cultivation will be much faster than before because of the Naiden. The Naiden can not only allow spiritual energy to be produced endlessly, but it also allows us to calm down. The path of Xiozhe is long and difficult. If one doesn't have a Naiden, not only will it be difficult for one's cultivation to advance, it will also cause inner demons to breed. Even if one's cultivation can still increase, it will be very easy for one to go berserk and fail to pass the tribulation. In the end, one will die.
Yes.
Meng Qi nodded again. Therefore, Xiozhe with a Naiden have a clear consciousness. Although the reconstruction of the spiritual sea is painful, they can still rely on themselves to withstand it. Li Che said slowly, but Yan Xian doesn't have a Naiden, so he can't withstand it. Li Che said, my sect has a secret technique. Sherzuan said it's about. He thought for a moment before continuing. It's an inheritance obtained from the Starfall Sea by a predecessor of a famous sect 3,000 years ago. That secret technique was a little strange. It had been passed down for many years, and even the previous generations of the sect didn't know what it was used for. Later on, a grandmaster used that secret technique to save his good friend. Huh. Meng Qi was still a little confused. Li Che looked into Meng Qi's eyes, lowered his voice, and said slowly, that grandmaster used a secret technique to temporarily switch his body with his good friends. Meng Qi was shocked and looked at Li Che in disbelief. Li Che smiled at her and continued. At that time, his good friend was seriously injured and on the verge of death. Grandmaster temporarily swapped bodies with him before he was cured. But Meng Qi frowned. This was too unbelievable. Like Li Che, she paced back and forth, and many thoughts flashed through her mind. Swapping bodies, yes. Li Che nodded. The Niden not only allows spiritual energy to grow and multiply endlessly, but it's also the source of divine sense. Swapping bodies is equivalent to entering his body together with the Niden. Then, he can endure the pain of reconstructing his spiritual sea. His voice became louder and louder as he spoke, and he looked at Meng Qi excitedly. If that's the case, we can take a gamble. But this is simply... Meng Qi stopped and suddenly turned to look at Li Che. Her black and white eyes were full of confusion. What's secret technique? Li Che scratched his head. The predecessor of the sect didn't know that the inheritance he received was actually incomplete. It was only the first half of a certain secret technique. Therefore, the previous generation gave the secret technique a name, the soul-shifting art. How will it affect you? Meng Qi immediately asked. It's nothing, Li Che. Meng Qi raised her voice slightly. We're still in the 7 emotions array. If anything happens to you, it's very likely that we'll fail miserably and we'll never be able to get out. She took a deep breath. I hope you won't hide it from me. Of course, Meng Qi wasn't worried that Li Che would drag her down. This kind of miraculous secret technique was simply unbelievable. She wouldn't be surprised if it could be used by a Dongjin or Mahayana cultivator. But judging from Li Che's tone, he could also use it. Then, the secret technique would definitely bring some backlash to the caster. Okay. Li Che was defeated under Meng Qi's gaze. He shrugged helplessly. I can tell you. He paused and said, if I use this secret technique, my cultivation level will be greatly reduced and I'll return to the nascent soul stage. What do you mean by returning to the nascent soul stage? Meng Qi asked. It means that I'll have to cultivate from the early nascent soul stage again, and my cultivation level will be directly reduced by 1 big realm. What else? Meng Qi didn't believe it was that simple. Even the divine sense could be exchanged. She didn't believe it was as simple as 1 big realm. Everything else is trivial, Li Che. Meng Qi called his name again. Okay. Li Che muttered. This time, the recultivation of the nascent soul stage will be more difficult. When I cross the tribulation again, the tribulation I'll experience will probably be similar to the tribulation from the nascent soul stage to the Dongxi stage. Meng Qi sucked in a breath of cold air. If the tribulation from the nascent soul stage was similar to the tribulation from the Dongxi stage, wouldn't Li Che stop at the nascent soul stage?
No.
Meng Qi shook her head. We'll think of another way. Her tone was firm. Meng Qi. Li Che took a step towards her. With my talent, the great perfection of the nascent soul stage is probably the limit. If I go 1 step further... He smiled bitterly. I know my own limits, but I can't have no hope in this life. I'm not like fellow Taoist Yan Xian, fellow Taoist Xueqing Xian, and fellow Taoist Pei Mufeng. They're generally cultivation geniuses. I know where the limit of my cultivation level and medical skills is. So, Li Che's tone was light, but very firm. Rather than being mediocre until old and silently dying like countless ordinary medical cultivators in the trichiliocosm, I'd rather give it a try. Li Che took another step towards Meng Qi. He was almost standing in front of Meng Qi. He was taller than Meng Qi. The two of them stood facing each other like this. Besides, if I can save him, I'll definitely save him. Li Che smiled at her again. It's just returning to the nascent soul stage. It's worth it if his spiritual sea can be repaired.
No.
Meng Qi shook her head. We'll think of another way. She said, there must be another way. Maybe there is. Li Che said, but we only have 3 days, and we can't ask for help from others. Only the two of us. He emphasized, this is the only way now. Li Che said, Meng Qi, please help me. His expression was serious. He looked straight into Meng Qi's eyes, and his tone was more serious than usual. No. Meng Qi's voice was low, but it was as firm as before. She suddenly had an idea. Teach me that secret technique. I'll do it. Let's not talk about the fact that I can't teach you the secret technique at all, because the jade slip recording the secret technique is still in the sect. Besides, if I do that, what kind of person would I be? Li Che smiled. Besides, Meng Qi, although Senior Lin Yan recognized you as a friend, among the countless medical cultivators in the 3,000 worlds, how many of them don't regard Senior Lin Yan as their goal? He said, if I can think of a way, I will definitely try and see if I can cure him, Li Che said. He stood with his hands behind his back, and his eyes were clear and firm. He looked at Meng Qi like this, and Meng Qi also looked up at him. She could even see her own small shadow reflected in Li Che's clear pupils from his eyes. Compared with the clear eyes of the blue-robed young man, she felt so small. Meng Qi, Li Che said again, don't forget, I'm also a medical cultivator. Chapter 174. After Li Che finished speaking, he patted Meng Qi's shoulder. Looking at her furrowed brows, he couldn't help but laugh. Meng Qi, be more decisive. Then it's decided. He continued, let's talk about something else first. He asked again, if Yan Xian's spirit sea can be successfully repaired, what do you plan to do with his inner core? Meng Qi hesitated and didn't speak. The netherworld spike and the stardust stone. Li Che continued, we have both now. This is an opportunity, Meng Qi. His tone became excited. For a medical practitioner, being able to encounter a situation like Yan Xian's and still be able to cure him was definitely something to look forward to. Let's think of a way to get the netherworld spike first, Meng Qi said, and pondered for a moment. She reached out and touched her storage bag, holding the medicine knife horizontally in her hand. You have a way? Li Che curiously followed beside her, waiting to see what she was going to do. Yes, I'll try. As she spoke, she bent over and began to draw on the ground.
He.
On that cliff, the eyes of the black-clothed sword practitioner sitting on the edge of the cliff lit up. He said, she's going to use a formation.
Oh.
The red-clothed woman quickly walked to his side and looked in the direction of Meng Qi and Li Che in the distance. The mountain wind blew. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and smiled slightly. I'm not surprised that she can think of using a formation. The black-clothed sword practitioner bent one leg. The lazy smile on his face deepened. After all, she's a disciple of a famous master, and she's quite talented in this area. It's a pity. He shook his head. His tone sounded regretful, but the smile on his face didn't fade. A hint of coldness even flashed through his eyes. It's a pity that her cultivation is too low. She can't control a formation to such a fine degree with her consciousness and cultivation.
Ha.
The white-haired man suddenly laughed coldly. What are you laughing at? The black-clothed swordsman turned his head and glanced at him unhappily. Am I wrong? If she had already reached the spirit-severing stage, there would still be a glimmer of hope in this situation. But she's just a nascent soul cultivator. So, what if her divine sense is powerful and she's a top nascent soul cultivator? The black-clothed swordsman laughed in schadenfreude. Don't tell me that she can split herself in half, with one half controlling the array and the other half healing people? There are many schools of Xiuzhe. In terms of combat power, sword Xiu, spell Xiu, and formation Xiu are naturally above medical Xiu. The white-haired man's tone was indifferent. But don't forget, when it comes to divine sense, medical practitioners have always been outstanding. So what? She was a nascent soul cultivator. No matter how strong her divine sense is, could it be that she can split her divine sense into two, like a function cultivator? Moreover, the divine sense of a medical cultivator is indeed stronger than that of other sects, but it's not to the extent that it can directly erase an entire realm. They don't dare to touch the netherworld spike, so they can only use the formation to control the puppets to retrieve it. After the netherworld spike is removed, it will quickly wither and lose its medicinal properties. Moreover, there's still the Stardust Stone. The black-clothed swordsman laughed in schadenfreude. His bent leg also hung down and swayed at the edge of the cliff. The mountain wind lifted his robes. He continued, "Don't tell me that her divine sense is so strong that she can split another strand and control the puppets to retrieve the Stardust Stone. That's the Styx River." The black-clothed swordsman put his hands behind his head and looked up at the white-haired man. Finally, he concluded, "Her cultivation is low. It's a pity." The black-clothed swordsman continued, "If she's already at the spirit-severing stage, she can split her divine sense into many strands. One strand can go to retrieve the netherworld spike. One strand can go to retrieve the Stardust Stone. The remaining strand can go to heal Yen Xian. That's really a rare occasion. A pity, a pity." He sat with his legs bent, swaying at the edge of the cliff with the wind. His eyes narrowed slightly, and he said in schadenfreude, "A pity that she's just a little nascent soul cultivator." "Humph." The white-haired man snorted and didn't argue with him any further, as if it wasn't a meaningful matter. He just stared into the distance, like the red-clothed woman who hadn't said a word. After a long while, the white-haired man slowly said, "You don't understand." His tone became a bit low. "Didn't we all think that little Yen couldn't do it?" When the black-haired swordsman heard the words, "You don't understand," he subconsciously opened his mouth to refute. But when he heard the name Little Yen, he closed his mouth again. He snorted lightly. It was clear that he still wasn't convinced by the white-haired man. But this time, he didn't say anything. "Enough." The red-clothed woman glared at the two of them. "You two, don't quarrel," she said. "We've been trapped here for many years. We can only know what the outside world has become through the cultivators that come here once every 10 years. 10,000 years have passed. The outside world has been turned upside down. Let's not talk about anything else." SLK. Calm, the red-clothed woman muttered to herself for a moment, and then slowly said, "The current Yao Lord is so strong and talented. Have you ever seen it before?" The black-clothed swordsman seemed to want to refute. He had already opened his mouth, but in the end, he tightly closed it again. He snorted lightly, one of his legs bent, and the other extended out of the cliff, swaying back and forth. After a long while, he lazily said, "You're so strange. So, what if 10,000 years have passed? The Ling energy of the three realms is declining. Didn't we already see it a few thousand years ago? If that Yao Lord was born 10,000 years ago, then he would be a true genius. He would be a true genius whose name could spread through the three realms. Perhaps he would be a step away from ascending. The three realms will still produce geniuses in the end," the red-clothed woman said with certainty. "What's left of the three realms' legacies?" The black-clothed swordsman said unwillingly, "You've also seen it. In these 10,000 years, the number of cultivators that can enter the 10 Extremes mountain is getting worse and worse. At the beginning of the 10,000 years, there were still people that could shine in front of us. 9,000 years ago, there were also geniuses that could catch my eye. Even 7,000 years ago, there were still occasionally some outstanding performances." The black-clothed sword cultivator suddenly sneered and said, "After that, there was more and more scheming and scheming, deceiving and deceiving each other. Because after leaving this place, we no longer remember what happened. Thus, we became more and more unrestrained. Every step towards the great Tao was difficult, but they had actually lost their original intentions from the very beginning. The Tao's heart is not firm. The Tao's heart is covered in dust. The Tao's heart is lost. The more he spoke, the lower his voice became. Even the lazy smile on his lips had disappeared. The mountain wind whistled past, brushing the black-clothed swordsman's hair. It also seemed to sweep away his voice. After a long time, he slowly said, year after year, round after round, until now, as he spoke, he turned his head to look at the red-clothed woman and the white-clothed woman. He said, I actually don't know what we are waiting for here. What are we looking forward to? After all, you also know that these people are the best of the best from the various sections. Without waiting for the red-clothed woman to speak, he rushed to say, that Yao Lord is indeed a genius. The fight for the Yao Lord token is indeed better than the previous few thousand years. But so what? Don't forget. The white-clothed man who had not spoken much suddenly said slowly, this is the third time the 7 emotions array has appeared in the past 10,000 years. He paused for a moment and then slowly said, the first 2 times were during the ancient times. Only this time, the 7 emotions array has reappeared after the ancient era's legacies were cut off. The black-clothed swordsman opened his mouth, then closed it again. He suddenly turned his head to look at that person, a strange light flashing through his eyes. He opened his mouth again, then closed it again. When the white-haired medical cultivator saw him like this, the corners of his lips slowly rose, revealing a somewhat complacent smile. Fine, fine. The black-clothed swordsman waved his hand and said impatiently, so, what if the 7 emotions array has reappeared? If they can really break through the 7 emotions array, then they can be considered capable. I think they can. The white-clothed woman's tone was certain. His smile had already disappeared, but his eyes were even more profound and bright than before. I even think, he muttered, we might have been wrong in the past. Wrong? The black-clothed swordsman suddenly jumped up. He straightened his back and stood in front of the white-clothed woman. He was actually very tall. At this moment, when he stood up straight, he was actually taller than the white-clothed woman. What did we do wrong? As he spoke, he lightly snorted, as if he was very dissatisfied. Do you mean that we were wrong, and these people were right? I don't know. The white-clothed woman slowly shook her head and muttered. Back then, he seemed to have thought of something that happened many years ago, and his expression became somewhat blank. His gaze even looked at an extremely distant place. Do you still remember what happened back then? The black-clothed swordsman's face sank, and instantly became extremely ugly. The red-clothed woman looked at the white-clothed woman, and then looked at the black-clothed swordsman, and said, you mean, back then, the 3 of us willingly retreated to this place. Do you still remember why? Of course I remember. The black-clothed swordsman unwillingly turned his head. But what does that have to do with today's matter? Swordsman, spell cultivator, medical cultivator. The white-clothed woman slowly said, the 3 of us retreated to 10 Extremes Mountain, and the legacies of the 3 major sects were also preserved. However, formation cultivators. He paused for a moment before continuing, but it's split into 2. The Ji clan followed the 3 realms and entered the demon realm and never saw the light of day again. They preserved the last bit of formation cultivators' legacies. As for the other formation cultivators, they sacrificed all their legacies and cultivation to protect the 3 realms from collapsing. The black-clothed swordsman was indifferent, and his head that had been held high also slowly lowered, and a trace of sorrow appeared in his eyes. Among them, there were our friends and relatives, and also, he looked at the black-clothed swordsman, and did not continue speaking. Why don't you continue speaking? The black-clothed swordsman continued. Sister Qing also perished like this that day. He said angrily, it's precisely because there are so many cultivators that they are about to ascend to immortality and become immortals. From then on, they won't die, and won't die. However, they were willing to perish for the 3 realms, for the cultivation world. It was because of this, it was because of this. The black-clothed swordsman lowered his head even more. In a flash, a few drops of sparkling water slid down his bronze skin and fell into the wind. His voice also became a bit hoarse. Even though this matter had already passed for 10,000 years, the sister Qing that he spoke of had already vanished into thin air, and not even a trace of her soul was left in this world. However, when he thought of the past, he still felt as if a huge and powerful hand was tightly gripping his heart, and it was so painful that he could not breathe. The white-clothed swordsman sighed and raised his hand and placed it on his shoulder. "What are you doing?" The black-clothed swordsman took a deep breath, raised his head, and slapped away the white-clothed swordsman's hand. "I don't need you to comfort me." He took another deep breath and continued, "It was because of this that I was so angry when I saw these useless people. Forget about the formation cultivators. Their legacies have been cut off, and the Ji clan can only stay in the darkest and most dangerous place in the demon realm. It is already difficult for them to not be corroded by the demon qi and not be assimilated. Also, they still have to..." Speaking to this point, he paused. After a while, when he opened his mouth again, he stiffly changed the topic. "But take a look at these 10,000 years. What kind of things have the three schools of Tao, sword, and medicine taught?" "They aren't." The black-clothed swordsman interrupted the white-clothed swordsman's words, without thinking. He almost used all his strength to shout, "They are terrible, and each generation is worse than the last. I'm so angry, so angry, so angry." He seemed to be so angry that he was about to jump up. The more he spoke, the angrier he became. His hands were behind his back, and he kept walking in circles on the mountain peak. It was as if he didn't do this, he wouldn't be able to control himself and charge out and beat up all the Xiuzha that were still fighting to vent his anger. The white-clothed swordsman and the red-clothed female swordsman looked at each other and shook their heads helplessly. The two of them believed that if there was a Xiuzha here right now, they would definitely be beaten black and blue by the black-clothed swordsman. The black-clothed swordsman didn't know how many circles he walked before he finally stood in front of the white-clothed swordsman and the red-clothed female swordsman with a cold face. He straightened his face and said, "Humph, let me see how those two brats are doing. If they are still in such a mess, I will." He didn't say what he would do, and just ran back to the cliff to sit down. One of his legs was still bent, while the other was sticking out of the cliff, swaying back and forth. Even that lazy and somewhat disdainful smile had returned to his face. The white-clothed swordsman's words just now seemed to be a breeze in his monotonous life of 10,000 years. He didn't care about it anymore. But could he really not care? The white-clothed swordsman slowly walked behind the black-clothed swordsman and looked at his hands that were at the side of his body. It was a pair of typical swordsman's hands. The fingers were long and dry, and the nails were neatly trimmed. He had seen it with his own eyes. When this pair of hands held a sword, it had stunned countless Xiuzha from the various races of the three realms. Right now, this pair of hands were tightly clenched into fists, and there wasn't the slightest bit of laziness on his face. The white-clothed swordsman raised his hand again, as if he wanted to place it on the black-clothed swordsman's shoulder. After a moment, he sighed lightly and didn't place it on him. He raised his eyes, and his gaze also floated into the distance like the black-clothed swordsman. When Meng Qi was immersed in drawing the formation, Li Che was sitting cross-legged not far from her. He didn't understand formations, and he knew that he couldn't help much, so he might as well cultivate his own. Even though he knew that his current cultivation was like a cup of water on a burning cart of firewood, and there was a limit to how much he could raise. But that was still better than sitting around and waiting. Right now, seeing that Meng Qi had stopped, Li Che hurriedly walked over and asked, "How is it?" Meng Qi squatted on the ground and looked intently at the formation she had drawn. She said with some difficulty, "There's still a question." He looked in front of Meng Qi and saw two complicated and exquisite formations spread out in front of the two. Those lines overlapped, and even though Li Che looked at Meng Qi's completed formation, he couldn't imagine how she had drawn it. Once the netherworld thorn is plucked, it will wither in an instant and then lose its medicinal properties. The Stardust Stone in this river is in its most primitive state. If it isn't refined using the Yao clan's secret technique, once it leaves the river, it will quickly turn into a pile of ashes. Li Che nodded. So if you want to use a puppet to retrieve the Netherworld Thorn or the Stardust Stone, you need to do it at the same time. Meng Qi continued. This 100 Ghosts, 100 Charms formation can have hundreds of puppets. If you want to find some common elixirs, you can let them do it at the same time. If you want to retrieve elixirs like the Netherworld Thorn or the Stardust Stone, the 100 Ghosts, 100 Charms formation can only summon one puppet and let it retrieve one of the elixirs. Didn't we just talk about? As soon as Li Che opened his mouth, Meng Qi shook her head. If curing Yan Xian is only the first step, this 7 emotions formation should have 7 stages. Before she could finish her sentence, Li Che had already understood what she meant. He nodded and said, Then what are you going to do? If I'm already at the spirit-severing stage, then it'll be easier. Meng Qi murmured, I can try to separate a strand of my divine sense to control another formation. With your help, we can give it a try. Li Che frowned. He stood up and paced back and forth with his hands behind his back. He hesitated and didn't say anything. Meng Qi was still squatting on the ground. She only looked up at Li Che. She looked at Li Che, who was already at the spirit-severing stage, and suddenly had an idea. You can control the formation.
Huh?
Li Che didn't understand. He immediately stopped and looked down at Meng Qi. The green-clothed female cultivator's eyes were bright and clear. She looked a little excited. This 100 Ghosts, 100 Charms formation is not difficult to learn. You should be able to control it with some basic knowledge. Not difficult? Li Che tilted his head and looked at the formation drawn on the ground. He was a little dazed. He really didn't know anything about formations, and he wasn't a formation cultivator. When he was in the sect, he only occasionally heard the elders mention some legends of ancient formation cultivators. Li Che also knew that later on, the inheritance of formation cultivators was cut off. There were no more formation cultivators in the 3,000 worlds. Even if there were weapon cultivators who rose again in the last few hundred years, they weren't true formation cultivators. When he thought of this, he couldn't help but stare blankly at the 2 complicated formations on the ground. Meng Qi said this formation wasn't difficult. Although it didn't seem simple, he was still willing to believe in Meng Qi. But this formation study, Li Che had a good memory. He vaguely remembered that Meng Qi had mentioned this 100 Ghosts, 100 Charms formation. It should be the formation used by the mysterious and powerful black-clothed man, Ji Wuzhong, during the Apricot Forest tournament. This 100 Ghosts, 100 Charms formation was taught to you by Ji Wuzhong. If you teach it to me, won't it be bad? Li Che asked Meng Qi. Meng Qi was slightly startled. She thought for a while and said hesitantly, This can't be considered taught to me by Ji Wuzhong. At that time, he used it once, and I learned it by myself. At that time, Ji Wuzhong didn't accept me as his disciple, and he didn't officially teach me this 100 Ghosts, 100 Charms formation. As she said, she looked at Li Che with her clear black and white eyes. She tilted her head slightly. Moreover, saving people is more important now. Even if we don't break this 7 emotions formation, we still have a way to save Yan Xian. No matter what the method is, before saving a life, all rules and shackles are nothing. Even if Ji Wuzhong really taught it to me, even if he doesn't allow it to be taught to outsiders, as long as it can be used to save people, I will still teach it to you. At most, when we leave here, I will go to find him and ask for forgiveness. Meng Qi raised her eyebrows slightly and lifted her chin slightly. Her gaze was more determined than before. Yes. Li Che stared at her for a while and suddenly nodded heavily. You're right. He paused and said, When the time comes, if Ji Wuzhong wants to punish you, I will bear the consequences with you. Yes. Meng Qi also nodded vigorously. She and Li Che looked at each other and smiled. Everything was understood, without words. She immediately taught him. Meng Qi took out her medicine knife and drew on the ground seriously. You are also a medical cultivator. Naturally, you are very familiar with the study of the meridians and blood vessels. Li Che nodded and said, There are 12 meridians and 8 special meridians in the human body. When a cultivator absorbs the spiritual energy of heaven and earth, the spiritual energy flows through the meridians and nourishes the bones and blood. Finally, it flows into the spiritual sea and increases one's cultivation level. He thought for a while and simply continued, when the spiritual sea is opened, the divine sense is born. When we need to use spiritual energy, the spiritual energy will come out from the spiritual sea and flow through the meridians, and the divine sense will become stronger. As a medical cultivator, Li Che was naturally clear about this.
Yes.
Meng Qi nodded. She held the medicine knife in her right hand and quickly drew a small formation on the ground. This small formation was much simpler than the 200 ghosts and charming formations that she drew earlier. Meng Qi drew it casually, and it was completed in a flash. It was as simple as drinking water and breathing. Although medical cultivators like us are not as powerful as magic cultivators and sword cultivators, we use more of our divine sense and control of spiritual energy. Therefore, our divine sense is usually stronger than sword cultivators and magic cultivators of the same level. It is especially suitable for learning formations. I think, Meng Qi said, the formation cultivators of the antiquity age must have had a very strong consciousness. Come and take a look.
Yes.
Li Che squatted down beside her and looked at the small formation with her. What formation is this? As he asked, he silently looked at the lines. Although this formation was simpler than the 100 Ghosts and 100 Charm formation, the lines were not as many and complicated. Li Che looked at it for a while and finally got a clue. Meng Qi raised her hand and threw out 12 8-stage spirit stones. As she waved her slender fingers, the 12 8-stage spirit stones were embedded in 12 positions of the formation. The spirit stones flashed, and the spiritual energy was instantly sucked out and gathered towards the center of the formation. This can't be considered a formation either. Meng Qi said, I came up with it myself based on the 12 meridians and our cultivation methods. Li Che? ? Meng Qi explained, these 12 lines. She pointed at the formation with the medicine knife and explained to Li Che, the lung meridian of Han-Tien connects to the large intestine meridian of Foot Yangming, and then the stomach meridian of Foot Yangming. As she explained, she drew the medicine knife along the lines of the formation. The formation requires the use of divine sense to control the spiritual energy, and it has to be completed in one go. Meng Qi said, just like our 12 meridians, the flow of spiritual energy will never stop, and it will form a formation. Do you understand? I understand. Li Che scratched his head blankly. Of course, he understood the meridians. Meng Qi was obviously using the knowledge of the meridians to help him understand the formation. He first memorized Meng Qi's words, and then said, continue. Embed these 12 spirit stones at the intersection of the 12 meridians and finally gather in the spiritual sea. Meng Qi explained. As the medicine knife finished the last stroke, a new formation was formed. She flicked her finger and sent in 12 spirit stones. Then, she raised her hand and took out a spirit herb from her storage space. Meng Qi placed the spirit herb in the center of the formation. The withered spirit herb suddenly bloomed and turned green. In just a short moment, the withered grass began to unfurl, and unexpectedly, it became emerald green again. Soon, not only did the spirit herb turn green, it also sprouted and started to grow again.
I see.
Li Che nodded thoughtfully. There were many spirit herbs and flowers in the 3 realms that grew by absorbing the spiritual energy of heaven and earth. This withered spirit herb absorbed the spiritual energy of 12 8th-grade spirit stones. Under the stimulation of the spiritual energy, it was reborn. Meng Qi smiled at him and explained, I have always thought that it is easy for us medical practitioners to learn the formation. She said, come and try it. On the cliff of the mountain in the distance, the black-clothed sword cultivator was stunned. He was almost petrified. After a while, he turned his head stiffly and looked at the white-haired medical practitioner. The black-clothed sword cultivator opened his mouth and stared at the white-haired medical practitioner. He asked in a hoarse voice, is it easy for you medical practitioners to learn the formation? The white-haired medical practitioner was speechless. Ha ha! The black-clothed sword cultivator suddenly burst out in laughter. There was no one else on the mountain peak. He laughed so hard that he hugged his stomach and almost rolled on the ground. This kid is probably wondering if he is an idiot. The black-clothed sword cultivator stopped laughing and pretended to wipe the corners of his eyes. Do you understand it? At this time, even the red-clothed female medical practitioner could not help but ask the white-haired medical practitioner, is her formation really that simple? Ha ha ha. The black-clothed sword cultivator, who was able to hold back his laughter, laughed wildly. Why don't you give it a try?
He teased.
The white-haired medical practitioner sighed softly. He realized that ever since Meng Qi entered the seven emotions formation, he started to sigh more often. He clenched his right hand, and a medicine knife appeared in his palm. The medicine knife was very short. It was only the length of 2 palms. The slightly curved blade was clearly different from the swords of the sword cultivators. The white-haired medical practitioner's medicine knife did not have any patterns on it. There was only a simple little fish engraved on the handle of the knife. There were only a few strokes on the little fish, but there was a light blue dot where the eye should be. It was inlaid with a transparent jade, making the little fish look much more lifelike. If the elders of the Wind Alliance or the Medical Cultivation Spell Conference saw this medicine knife, they would have already cried out in shock. In truth, in the past 10,000 years, this medicinal knife had never appeared in the 3 realms. However, almost all of the ancient medical sects had records of this medicinal knife. Those ancient records did not spend too much time describing the shape of the medicine knife. However, they would accurately record the little fish on the handle of the medicine knife. Also, there was a bit of jade where the little fish's eye should be. The jade was only the size of a grain of rice. It came from the last generation of the strongest formation cultivation sect in the ancient times. It was the most talented formation cultivator. It was said that she had refined the essence of a sea of carps into a peacock stone before embedding it into the handle of the medicine knife. The white-haired medical practitioner held the medicine knife. He would know if there were spirit flowers, spirit herbs, or spirit herbs that were rank 3 or above within 100 miles. The white-haired medical practitioner had not taken out his medicine knife for a very long time. At this moment, he held the knife horizontally. The black-clothed sword cultivator's laughter suddenly stopped. Not only did he stop laughing, he even withdrew the smile on his face. His face once again revealed a sorrowful and nostalgic expression. His gaze fell on the medicine knife in the white-haired medical practitioner's hand, as if he was caressing his lover. The white-haired medical practitioner crouched down and drew a formation on the ground like Meng Qi. After a short moment, he looked at the messy lines on the ground that were unable to form a formation and frowned. Your divine sense is obviously stronger than that little girl's. The black-clothed sword cultivator looked at the messy lines and muttered. He blinked his eyes and looked back at Meng Qi. That little girl is clearly a medical practitioner. How can her talent in formations be so terrifying? The black-clothed sword cultivator could naturally hear what Meng Qi was saying. He suddenly opened his right hand, and a black long sword fell into his palm. Could it really be that simple? The black-clothed sword cultivator muttered to himself as he quickly drew on the ground. After a short while, a mess of lines appeared on the mountain peak. It looked even messier than the white-haired medical practitioners. The black-clothed sword cultivator cursed under his breath and swept his long sword across the ground. In the blink of an eye, the messy lines on the ground were wiped clean. Sister Qing's sect has always been strict in recruiting disciples. So this is how it is. He muttered, and could not help but turn to look at Meng Qi. The green-clothed female practitioner was squatting on the ground obediently. Her back was slim and thin. Her black hair was casually tied behind her head, revealing her slender and fair neck. Her slender hands were holding a medicine knife, and she was quickly drawing a formation on the ground. Her movements were smooth, and there was not a trace of hesitation or pause. A breeze blew through the seven emotions formation and lifted a few strands of her hair that were hanging down by her cheeks. Everything looked so beautiful and familiar. The black-clothed sword cultivator blinked his eyes and suddenly raised his hand slowly towards Meng-Chi. Ching! As soon as he said the word, he immediately came to a realization. The black-clothed sword cultivator blinked hard and suddenly jumped back to the edge of the cliff. He suddenly laughed loudly and deliberately raised his voice. That kid is probably going to cry because of his stupidity.
Ha ha ha.
Li Che was indeed about to cry. He sat on the ground with his legs crossed and looked at the messy lines in front of him. He could not help but look at the medicine knife in his hand. Why was it that Meng-Chi was able to draw so effortlessly when it was just a medicinal knife? Why was it that he couldn't draw it? After a while, Li Che turned to look at Meng-Chi. Meng-Chi was also confused. Why don't we? She thought for a while. You draw with me? Let's try again. She explained, first, use your spiritual sense to control the aura and turn it into a continuous thin line. It doesn't need to be very strong, but it must not be broken. Li Che was a little disheartened. I probably don't have this talent. His chin was almost touching his chest. Originally, my talent was only average. Let's try again. Meng-Chi said firmly. You draw with me?
Okay.
Li Che took a deep breath and forced himself to be spirited. He had a vague feeling that this matter was not as simple as it seemed. Meng-Chi, Li Che casually asked, when you first started learning about the array formation, was it this difficult for you to open the array formation as well? Meng-Chi did not speak. Li Che's hand that was holding the medicine knife paused, and then turned to look at the silent Meng-Chi. He was startled, and when he opened his mouth again, his voice was trembling. Didn't you say just now? You thought of this array by yourself? Yes, Meng-Chi nodded. Li Che blinked and looked at Meng-Chi, and then at the small array on the ground. Of course, what he drew was a mess and could not be called an array. Because of this, Meng-Chi's neat and beautiful array was particularly pleasing to the eye. Did you? Li Che remembered what Meng-Chi said when he mentioned the 100 ghosts and 100 charm array and murmured, did you learn it just by looking at it?
Yes.
Meng-Chi nodded gently. Li Che, Meng-Chi. She took a deep breath and said, let's try again.
Okay.
Li Che nodded helplessly. He guessed that he would not be able to learn it. This array was not that easy to learn. Was this the difference between a genius and an ordinary person? Li Che felt a little bitter in his mouth. But very quickly, he pulled himself together. This was not the first time Li Che had tasted this. He remembered when he was 12 years old, he followed his master to the west border for the first time and saw the young genius who had already become famous in the medical field. He was the eldest son of the Shui family of the Wind Alliance, Shui Qingxian. Shui Qingxian was only 2 years older than him. His talent in medical practice was completely different from his. His master and the elders of the Shui family were discussing the Tao. He and Shui Qingxian were waiting and listening on the side. After his master and the elders of the Shui family finished talking, before he could understand anything, Shui Qingxian was already able to discuss the reasons behind it with the two elders. He could even give his own opinion. Shui Qingxian was obviously as young and immature as he was, but he was able to remain calm and composed. Li Che was deeply impressed by the way he spoke with assurance. He still remembered that when he left the Shui family, his master looked at the sky and suddenly sighed. Li Che did not ask why his master sighed. But from the faint melancholy in his master's sigh, he could tell that his master also hoped to have such an intelligent, outstanding, and talented disciple. Li Che clenched his medicine knife. He gathered his thoughts. He knew that his future achievements would never be as good as Shui Qingxian. He would never be as good as Shui Qingxian. He turned his head slightly and quickly glanced at Meng-Chi. The green robe wrapped around Meng-Chi's thin body. Her expression was so focused that it did not seem like she was looking down on him. Li Che took a deep breath. His gaze fell on the medicine knife in Meng-Chi's hand. His achievements were indeed limited, and he would never be able to match up to these talented geniuses. However, he also had his own Tao. He would follow his own path. Step by step, firmly, and without hesitation, he would walk forward. When Li Che thought of this, he clenched the medicine knife in his hand. At this moment, in the originally clear and cloudless blue sky of the Seven Emotions formation, at a place where no one could see, there was suddenly a soft pop sound. A few wisps of smoke appeared in the sky. The smoke appeared too quickly. It disappeared into the horizon in a flash. It was as if it was just a light breeze that did not attract anyone's attention. But at the center of the 10 Extremes mountain, on the mountain peak where the black-clothed sword cultivators were, the three of them suddenly became silent. Around the mountain where the three of them were, there were 10 tall mountains like stars surrounding the moon. The 10 tall mountains were like 10 sharp blades. They were tall and steep, towering straight into the clouds. At this moment, one of the tall mountains was actually gradually surrounded by clouds. After the clouds and mist dispersed, there were many trees and bushes growing on the barren mountain just a moment ago. The black-clothed sword cultivator stood up. He looked at the tall mountain in disbelief. He muttered to himself as he quickly walked towards that direction. Actually, the mountain peak where the three of them were at was not very big. There was also some distance between them and the surrounding 10 tall mountains. Even if he walked closer to that mountain, he would not be able to get much closer. But if he did so, he would be able to see more clearly. The black-clothed sword cultivator repeated. He said, "Could it be that this time?" He turned his head to look at his two companions. "Have you seen it yet?" "We saw it." The red-clothed female cultivator nodded. She also walked closer to that mountain. She looked at the tall mountain in a daze. Then, she raised her head and looked at the sky. "The clouds are forming. Someone has touched the path." "Someone's?" The black-clothed sword cultivator suddenly turned his head.
He frowned.
"Who is it? A little girl? That can't be right. Or is it that silly boy?" Even though he was asking, he did not need anyone to answer. He did not wait for the red-clothed female cultivator to speak. He said, "It can't be that silly boy. That silly boy is the Xiozha, with the worst talent I've ever seen. Silly and dazed. Silly and dazed. Silly and dazed." The black-clothed sword cultivator repeated himself a few times. He could not help but look at his two companions again. "It can't really be him, right?" he exclaimed in disbelief. "I would rather believe that it is that little girl." The red-clothed female cultivator was deep in thought. She did not say anything. "Hey!" The black-clothed sword cultivator finally could not hold it in. He jumped to the white-haired medical cultivator's side. "You are also a medical cultivator. Tell me, is it him or not?" "If I were to choose..." The white-haired medical cultivator opened his mouth and said slowly, "If I were to choose one of these two to be my disciple..."
"No."
He shook his head and said, "Including all the cultivators who have entered the 10 Extremes mountain in the past 10,000 years, if I were to choose one to be my disciple, I would choose the silly boy that you look down on." Ran when the black-clothed sword cultivator was stunned. He looked at the white-haired medical cultivator's eyes. It was as if he could not believe what he had just heard. The white-haired medical cultivator's eyes were as clear as water. It was just like the first time they had met. After being trapped here for 10,000 years, the black-clothed sword cultivator's originally irritable temper became even more explosive. This person had always been the same. Her temperament, which he couldn't stand when they first met, had never changed. At this time, among the 10 mountains surrounding them, not far from the mountain that was covered in clouds and mist, another mountain suddenly became shrouded in clouds and mist. It became like a paradise. The black-clothed sword cultivator really jumped up this time. He did not bother to ask why the white-haired medical cultivator would choose Li Che.
He pointed at the second mountain.
His finger trembled slightly. In the past 10,000 years, it was not that such a situation had never happened before. However, when a mountain was shrouded in clouds and mist, it would wait for a long time. When the 10 Extremes mountain was about to close and return to silence, there would be a second mountain shrouded in clouds and mist. He had never seen a situation where the seals on both mountains were unlocked in such a short period of time. This time, it was not only him. The white-haired medical cultivator and the red-clothed female medical cultivator were also stunned. They looked at each other. Their gazes simultaneously drifted to the distance and landed on Meng Qi and Li Che, who were in the Seven Emotions formation. The two of them were still squatting on the ground. Meng Qi was seriously explaining how to draw the formation. As she explained, she held the medicine knife and demonstrated. She didn't have any intention of hiding anything. She really wanted to teach Li Che. Meng Qi. After another failure, Li Che shook his head. "I'm afraid it won't work." He frowned and said firmly, "Even if I can learn it in the end, we don't have that much time." Li Che, listen to me first. Li Che waved his hand and said, "And this formation is completely incomparable to the 100 Ghosts and 100 Charm formation. When I learn the 100 Ghosts, 100 Charm array, I still have to split my attention to control the two arrays to retrieve the Netherworld Thorn and Stardust Stone. Meng Qi, how long do you think it will take for me to reach that step?" Meng Qi was silent. Li Che could not help but laugh. He suddenly reached out and rubbed Meng Qi's head. "You also think that this is a long and difficult task, right?" Meng Qi did not say a word. Li Che smiled bitterly. "My talent is limited. I don't think this method will work. Let's think of another way." As he spoke, he and Meng Qi turned to look at the flowing stream. Under the sunlight, the Stardust Stone in the stream shone with golden light. Right next to the stream, the Netherworld Thorn, which was rare and precious in the three realms, was scattered randomly. They clearly had the elixir in front of them, and they clearly could find a way to cure Yanxian. However, because of their lack of cultivation or talent, they could only watch helplessly. It was really painful. Let's think again. Thinking about this, even Li Che could not remain calm. He walked back and forth a few times with his hands behind his back. He kept trying to recall the medical books and pharmacopoeias that he had read. He wanted to recall more records about the Stardust Stone and the Netherworld Thorn. Alas, Li Che sighed, when it's time to use the books, I regret not having enough. If only I could go back to the sex library now. Meng Qi was slightly stunned. She suddenly remembered, I still have some bamboo slips and jade slips here. As she spoke, she took out the bamboo slips that she had borrowed from the Heaven and Earth book house from her storage bag. Maybe we can find some records, Meng Qi said as she handed half of them to Li Che. We'll each take half. Oh, right. She was a little annoyed. I still have a medical manual here. As she spoke, she entered her spiritual sea. Above Meng Qi's spiritual sea, a bamboo slip was wrapped in spiritual energy and emitted a faint light. It was the medical manual that Senior Lin Yan had left for her. She had not been able to read some of the contents until now. Senior Lin Yan. Meng Qi said in her heart, Junior, it's more important to save people. Up until now, Meng Qi had read as much of Lin Yan's medical manual as she had read. Meng Qi only had indescribable respect and admiration for this ancient medical practitioner senior. She did not dare to show any disrespect. However, at this moment, she slowly separated a strand of her divine sense and extended it toward the medical manual. Chapter 175. In the beginning, Meng Qi was only probing carefully. The medical practice letter that Lin Yan gave her was floating in the air above her spiritual sea. It was wrapped in a cloud of spiritual energy and was gently floating. The strand of consciousness that Meng Qi sent out slowly extended towards the medical practice letter. Ugh! She suddenly let out a muffled groan. Her green robe swayed, and her entire body fell backwards. What's wrong? Li Che was holding a jade slip and reading it attentively. When he heard the movement, he quickly reached out and helped Meng Qi up. He looked at her worriedly. Is it not working? Meng Qi shook her head. She took a deep breath and sat cross-legged again. She didn't expect that the medical practice letter would produce such a huge force that easily slapped away her divine sense. Junior didn't mean to offend you. Meng Qi looked at Yan Xian, who was lying quietly on the ground. She silently said in her heart, "Please forgive me for saving my friend's life. BQGXSYDW. Calm this time, she separated her divine sense into 3 strands and extended them from 3 different directions towards the medical practitioner's handwritten letter. Please forgive me, Senior. Meng Qi took a deep breath. At the place where the medical practice letter slapped away, her divine sense suddenly sped up and rushed towards the small medical practice letter wrapped in spiritual energy. Meng Qi? Li Che held the jade slip in his hand and looked at her with concern. He didn't know what Meng Qi wanted to do, but he guessed that she was probably doing something dangerous for Yan Xian. If you can't do it, then forget it. Let's read these medical books first. I found that this scroll actually recorded some medical skills from the demon world. I've never heard of them before, Yan Xian said as he raised the jade slip in his hand towards Meng Qi. The jade slip looked quite old. It was unknown how many people had read it. It was smooth and warm. I'm fine. Meng Qi shook his head, still looking a little dazed. She had already prepared herself for her consciousness to be slapped back by the power of the medical handbook. It really didn't hurt, but the consciousness of a medical practitioner was always stronger and sharper than the practitioners of other schools. Being slapped away by an external force was not a good feeling. She had never imagined that things would go so smoothly this time. Meng Qi sat upright and still, and his expression became solemn. Thank you, Senior, she said again in her heart. Meng Qi did not believe that his divine sense would advance by leaps and bounds and become stronger. The only possibility was that he had agreed to let her read the medical notes. 3 strands of divine sense carefully reached out to the medical practice handbook. Scrolls of words suddenly opened up in front of her eyes and flew past. Meng Qi couldn't see the flashing words clearly, but he could occasionally see a few words. She was a little anxious. If this was the case, she wouldn't be able to see anything. Suddenly, the words in the medical practice letter slowed down. Several lines of beautiful words were imprinted into Meng Qi's eyes. There are stones in the Yao realm, like falling stars, born in the extremely cold lakes of the Yao realm. They are the same as the spirit-devouring grass, nightless fruit, 5-spirit flower, and Taishan wood. After being refined by the cold spring spirit dew, they can be used to repair the spiritual sea. They can be refined together with the netherworld thorn. With the nirvana fruit as the guide, they can be used to repair the Niden. Stardust stones can only be stored in extremely cold water. The Yao realm has the Baiming Lake, the Mo realm has the river Styx, and the 3,000 worlds can use the cold spring spirit dew. Meng Qi had been sitting cross-legged. At this moment, she suddenly slapped her knee. She had the cold spring spirit dew. She was really stupid. If the cold spring spirit dew could be used to refine stardust stones, it could also be used to preserve them.
Meng Qi?
Li Che looked at Meng Qi in surprise. I'm fine. Meng Qi waved her hand at him, her face a little hot. The words on Senior Lin Yan's medical practice handbook flashed quickly in front of her. She now understood that there were still some contents in the medical practice handbook that she couldn't read. However, she could read what she wanted now. Sure enough, the rolling words of the medical practice handbook slowed down again, and a few lines of words appeared clearly in front of Meng Qi's eyes. The netherworld spike is extremely poisonous. It will invade the divine sense and inner core. The poisoned person will not survive. Their cultivation will be damaged, and there is no cure. However, it can be refined with stardust stones and use the nirvana fruit as a guide to repair the inner core. After this paragraph of words, the medical practice handbook slowly closed. Finally, it returned to the spiritual aura and floated in the air above Meng Qi's spiritual sea. Meng Qi held her chin with her hand and stared blankly in front of her. What's wrong, Meng Qi? Li Che saw her like this and asked again. The stardust stones can be stored with the cold spring spiritual dew, or directly stored with the river Styx. Meng Qi said.
Huh?
Li Che turned to look at the cheerful stream. Isn't this the river Styx? We don't have anything that can store the river Styx. Meng Qi said, but I have the cold spring spiritual dew. She took out a jade bottle containing the cold spring spiritual dew from her storage bag. Take out the Stardust Stones. They can be stored in here first. What about the Netherworld spike? Li Che asked. It's extremely poisonous. The poison will invade the inner core and the divine sense. There is no cure. Meng Qi repeated the words on the medical practice handbook. I see. Meng Qi shrugged and smiled. No matter what, at least one problem has been solved. We can take out the Stardust Stones first. As she spoke, she took out the medicine knife and bent down to quickly draw on the ground. Wherever the medicine knife passed, the clear lines quickly connected into pieces. Even though Li Che had seen it with his own eyes just now, he couldn't help but sigh. Using spiritual energy as a knife, she could draw such a large and complicated line. She could also ensure that the structure was exquisite without any mistakes. Only then could she finally form a formation. This was probably not something that could be done with a strong divine sense. Li Che smiled bitterly and thought of the messy lines he had drawn. In the blink of an eye, Meng Qi had already stood up straight. She casually touched her storage bag and flicked her fingers. A dozen or so shiny spirit stones flew towards the formation and neatly embedded themselves in the formation. Xian spirit stones. Li Che was speechless. Meng Qi had casually thrown out a handful of Xian spirit stones. He also knew that although Meng Qi always wore green clothes and looked simple, she had a lot of spirit stones on her. But those were Xian spirit stones after all. The Surging Waves Academy that Li Che was in was already a very powerful medical cultivation sect in the Southern Land. Although the medical cultivation of the Southern Land was weak, it was still one of the 3,000 worlds. The scale of their Surging Waves Academy was not small. Even so, it would probably be a bit difficult for his master to casually take out a dozen or so Xian spirit stones and then casually throw them out.
Yes.
Meng Qi nodded. This Styx River is extremely cold and very powerful. My cultivation is low, and I'm worried that the little ghosts summoned by the 100 Ghosts 100 Charm formation won't be able to hold on until I take out the Stardust Stones. As she spoke, she casually pulled Li Che, and the two of them retreated a few steps. In the 100 Ghosts 100 Charm formation, after the Xian Spirit Stones fell, the Spirit Qi light followed the lines drawn by Meng Qi and quickly connected into pieces. The Xian Spirit Stones contained a lot of Spirit Qi, and all the light gathered towards the center of the formation. In just an instant, the center of the formation seemed to light up like stars. It wasn't that Li Che had never seen a formation activated before, but he still couldn't help but hold his breath and stare unblinkingly at the bright and dazzling stars. The stars gradually started to change. First, for limbs stretched out from the stars. Then, a short white figure replaced the stars. The light on its body was brilliant and bright. It jumped a few times on the spot and stretched its limbs. Then, it turned its head and skipped towards Meng Qi. Li Che gasped in amazement. The Surging Waves Academy could be considered a sect with ancient inheritances. These academies with ancient inheritances would more or less have some ancient secrets passed down. When the weapon cultivators rose to prominence, he also heard the elders in the sect mention that there was a sect called Formation Cultivators in the ancient 3,000 worlds. Formation cultivators used formations to fight and were incomparably powerful. They were a powerful sect that could compete with spell cultivators and sword cultivators. But for some reason, sword cultivators, spell cultivators, and medicine cultivators all had inheritances passed down from ancient times. Only formation cultivators seemed to have completely disappeared from the ancient 3,000 worlds overnight. Not a single sect was passed down. When Li Che first heard about it, he couldn't imagine how formation cultivators fought at all. He knew a lot about the weapon cultivators' weapon refining method. Medicine cultivators needed magic treasures, cauldrons used to refine weapons, medicine knives, silver needles, etc. They couldn't be separated from weapon cultivators. He wasn't unfamiliar with this sect. He felt that weapon cultivators should be the same as medicine cultivators. They weren't strong in battle and weren't as confident and decisive as spell cultivators and sword cultivators. That was until he saw Ji Wujiang's marvelous array formation in the Apricot Forest tournament. Then, he saw Meng Qi's formation here. Li Che opened his eyes wide and looked at the white figure that skipped to Meng Qi's side. The green-clothed female cultivator bent down and put the cold spring spiritual dew into a jade box. Then, she handed it to the white figure and pointed at the Styx River. The white figure stuffed the jade box into its body, turned around, and skipped towards the Styx River. The Styx River was still flowing happily. Li Che knew that if a cultivator stepped into the river, even if they were already in the spirit-severing stage, or even if their cultivation was higher, they would be instantly frozen into ice. Not only their flesh and blood, but even their Ling Si, the Ling Qi in their Ling Si, and their Niden would all be frozen. A cultivator, who couldn't even use a strand of Ling Qi, would be no different from an ordinary person. Li Che suddenly felt a little nervous. This white figure that came out of the formation wouldn't be completely frozen, right? In the blink of an eye, the little white figure had already run to the Styx River. Without hesitation, it stepped into the Styx River. Li Che couldn't help but cry out. The moment the little white figure stepped into the Styx River, a thin layer of ice began to spread from its feet, completely freezing it inside. It's like this. Before Li Che could finish his words, the little white figure quickly shook its body. In the sound of breaking ice, the layer of ice on its body shattered and fell back into the river. It didn't freeze it, Li Che murmured softly. He couldn't help but turn his head to look at Meng Qi, who was standing beside him. The green-clothed female cultivator looked calm, but when Li Che looked at her, Meng Qi suddenly sighed. "What's wrong?" Li Che asked. "Formation cultivator." Meng Qi took out a handful of Xian spirit stones from her storage bag. "They spend more money than us medical cultivators," she muttered. Beside them, the Ling Qi on the 100 Ghosts and 100 Demons formation was indeed much dimmer than before. Accompanied by the sound of ice breaking, the white shadow imp walked forward. With every step it took, the radiance of the 100 Ghosts and 100 Demons array would become dimmer. It had only taken 3 steps, and the Ling Qi on the formation, which was still bright just now, had become so dim that it was almost disappearing. Meng Qi waved her hand, and another dozen Xian spirit stones fell into the formation. Li Che, he subconsciously touched his storage bag. For this trip to the 10 Extremes Mountain, the sect specially gave him some Xian spirit stones as backup. He only had a few Xian spirit stones. He was afraid that it wouldn't even be enough to support the little white figure to take 2 steps. Crack, crack, crack. The little white figure skipped towards the center of the stream. Meng Qi had already thrown out Xian spirit stones for the 4th time. More than 10 Xian spirit stones, more than 10 Xian spirit stones, and more than 10 more Xian spirit stones. The stream was clearly not wide, but she had spent nearly 100 Xian spirit stones to send it to the center of the stream. The little white figure finally stopped. Its body was quickly frozen by ice, and it shook its body as usual. A crack, crack, crack. Amidst the pleasant sounds of ice breaking, the ice did not shatter and fall from its body like before. The Xian spirit stones that Meng Qi had just thrown into the 100 Ghosts 100 Charm formation dimmed again. The Ling Qi in the formation was faintly discernible, as if it would completely disappear in the next instant. The ice around the little white figure grew thicker and thicker. Now there wasn't even a crack sound. Ha! On the cliff far away, the black-clothed sword cultivator let out a hearty laugh. "Let's see what she's going to do now." He bent his legs and continued to sit on the edge of the cliff, allowing the mountain wind to blow through his hair. His tone carried a hint of schadenfreude. "She's almost out of Xian's spirit stones, right?" The black-clothed sword cultivator seemed to be very pleased with himself. He did not need his 2 companions to continue speaking, and continued to speak. "She's just a little nascent soul cultivator, yet she can take out 100 Xian spirit stones. This girl is quite rich. What a pity, what a pity. She spent almost 100 Xian spirit stones and still failed at the last step. Tisk. He shook his head. Her cultivation is still too low. Is there really no other way? The red-clothed spell cultivator looked at the white-haired medical cultivator. What other ways can there be? The black-clothed sword cultivator looked back at her and rushed to say, the closer to the center of the Styx River, the colder it gets. To think she thought of a way to summon the little ghost to take the Stardust stones. What a pity! As he spoke, the corners of his lips curled up, but there was no smile in his eyes. Unless she has a few hundred more Xian spirit stones to force her way through, there's still hope. She's just a little nascent soul cultivator. How could she have 100 Xian spirit stones? She must have taken them from those cultivators before, right? At most, she can take out 100 more? That little ghost won't be able to come back. Do you want her to break the formation or not? The red-clothed spell cultivator glared at her. If the 7 emotions formation cannot be broken this time, who knows when it will be opened again? At this point, she pursed her lips and her gaze dimmed, just like the 100 ghosts and 100 charms formation. How much longer can we wait? Humph, the black-clothed sword cultivator snorted coldly. He opened his mouth and wanted to say something, but the white-haired medical cultivator suddenly said, "Look." The red-clothed spell cultivator said. At this moment, the 100 ghosts and 100 charms formation by the Styx River was glowing brightly. The spirit energy was so dense that it was as if there were no more stars twinkling there, but a small sun shining brightly. Li Che opened his mouth slightly and looked at Meng Qi in disbelief, then at the 100 ghosts and 100 charms formation. Did he see wrongly? Just now, Meng Qi waved his hands, and at least 100 Xian spirit stones fell into the 100 ghosts and 100 charms formation. At this moment, in the Styx River, the white imp, which was completely surrounded by ice and was about to disappear into the ice, suddenly became bright. Kacha, 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 sounds of ice breaking could be heard. The white imp stretched out its 4 limbs and jumped out of the broken ice. The moment the little white ghost broke out of the ice, the dazzling formation dimmed again. Meng Qi snorted and threw another 2 handfuls of nearly 100 Xian spirit stones towards the formation. Li Che. He silently retracted his hand that was pressing on his storage bag. Meng Qi, there really are a lot of Xian spirit stones. At this moment, the green-clothed female cultivator had already turned back to look at the center of the stream. Her eyes flashed and she raised her voice, ordering the little white ghost, "Pick up a few more." You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.